For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. Happy New Year, everybody. It's Tiger Baseball 1993.
The voice of the turtle was recited by Ernie Harwell at the beginning of each new baseball season. Listen closely. The voice of the turtle. The voice of baseball, Ernie Harwell. From the age of 6, I can remember falling asleep at night, transistor radio under my pillow, so as not to let my parents know I was still awake, listening to the voice of the turtle. Pitch after pitch, season after season, I grew up listening to the voice of the turtle as he painted a picture in my mind as to what was happening on the field, in the stands, and the importance of each and every moment. Having treasured that voice as a connection to my youth, my parents, and my grandparents, it is my sincere hope that by listening to this book, you too may hear that voice, remember where you were when you were 6, and drift back to a time and place that was everything good. Everything good about sport, and particularly everything good about baseball.
Hello, I'm Ernie Harwell. That voice you heard belongs to Gordon Miller, sports broadcaster from Raleigh, North Carolina, who grew up in Detroit. It was Gordon who brought this all together, because as a youngster he put his transistor and me under his pillow. A lot of people did that, thanks to the station I worked on, WJR Detroit. WJR had a powerful signal. The star of the station was their morning man, J.P. McCarthy. Once in a while, some lady would tell me, "I hear you all the time on those Tiger games. When you broadcast on the West Coast, I go to bed with you." Then I'd reply, "You might have gone to bed with me, but I'm sure that you woke up with J.P. McCarthy." Gordon Miller phoned me from Raleigh. He wanted to produce an audio book, and I passed along the information to my good friend and lawyer agent Gary Spicer. They got together, and now I'm talking in a talking book. I'm just one of the many voices you'll hear. You'll hear a voice asking questions. It belongs to Bob Harris, talented sports announcer, who's been the voice of Duke basketball and football for more than 30 years. I'm saying these words in the Ron Rose recording studio in Detroit, where the folks here have been a tremendous help. We owe a special thanks to Leo Gillis, Chip Kipps, and Dion Roddy, outstanding engineers. The idea of this audio scrapbook was simple. Sit me down in the studio, let Bob Harris ask questions, and let me try to answer. We had no script. The questions were spontaneous, strictly off the cuff, unrehearsed, and you'll have to take me that way, just as I am. So let me say thank you very much for listening.
Where did it all begin? Well, for William Ernest Harwell, it all began on January 25th, 1918, in a spot that was not the crossroads of the South. It was not Atlanta, but it was not very far. Washington, Georgia. Ernie, what was it like growing up in rural Georgia in the 20s?
Washington, Georgia was a small town, probably had about 2,000 inhabitants. Basically, it was agricultural. It was a cotton town. In fact, my dad and his brother Tom had a furniture store and also had a funeral home, because in those days the people that made the caskets made furniture also, and they ran this store, the Harwell Furniture Company, and they depended a lot on the farmers around Washington, Georgia for their purchases, and the farmers had a tough time because that was when the boll weevil came into the South and killed a lot of the cotton crops. And my dad and uncle had extended credit to many of the farmers, and when the farmers couldn't pay, my uncle and dad talked about going bankrupt. My father refused to do it, but he had to give up the company and move to Atlanta.
Now, it didn't take you long to make friends and begin influencing people, did it?
Well, I don't know about that, Bob, but I began to sell magazines. And I was about 5 or 6 years old when I sold the Saturday Evening Post, and we also sold Liberty. My family had a tough time economically. We moved down to Westminster Drive. My dad bought a house, paid about $2,000 for it at the time. This was pretty much in the middle of the Depression. And he was working for Mather Brothers Furniture Company. He'd gotten this job as the manager and a salesman there, and he was stricken with the multiple sclerosis, and he really didn't work from the time he was about 35 years old until he died at the age of 72. and my mother had become the breadwinner. She made cakes and sandwiches and supported the family. And the boys, yours truly and my brother Dick, my brother Davis, we did everything we could to help out. We delivered the goods that my mother cooked. We'd go down to the city of Atlanta. We'd go downtown on the streetcar for a nickel, take a cake that my mom had made. We'd sell it to the drugstore there for 50 cents. They'd cut it up and sell a slice for maybe a dime, and we'd pay another nickel and come on home on the streetcar. And I also got a paper route, what we call carried the Atlanta Georgian, which was sort of the third paper in town. They had the Constitution, the Journal, and the Georgian was a Hearst paper. And I had a paper route, and I had to go over it 3 times because they had 3 different editions. They had the Final Home, and then they had the Market edition, which had the stock market results in it, and then they had the Peach, which was the baseball extra, telling what the Crackers had done and the other teams around baseball, what they'd done in the day games. So I went over my paper route 3 different times each day, and I also had a Sunday paper to deliver, and I made about $2 a week.
And you had a very famous person on that route. I'm sure you didn't realize at that time that she was going to do the things that she did, but Margaret Mitchell sure made a name for herself too, didn't she?
She certainly did, the author of the great Gone with the Wind, and she was on my paper route for the Georgian. She lived up on the Prado, had an apartment there, and I delivered the paper to her, and as you always had to do, I had to collect for the paper too. I think the charge for the Georgian was 10 cents a week.
A bargain at any price.
Right, daily and Sunday both.
Collecting for the paper and interacting with the people, you had a problem growing up, being tongue-tied.
I think any time you couldn't speak clearly, it was embarrassing. And it was especially embarrassing in Atlanta because at this time I was going to grammar school, and the rule in Atlanta schools was that every student in the 5th and 6th grades in the public schools had to either debate or make a speech at least once a month. So my family, not having much money, they scraped up some money and sent me to what we called in those days an elocution teacher or an expression teacher. And now I think she'd be called a speech therapist. But this lady was named Margaret Lackland, and she worked in her home, and we'd go there and learn these speeches like Horatius at the Bridge, or Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, or In Flanders Field, or House by the Side of the Road, and all the poems, and we'd recite those. And also she'd coach us on how to debate. It was sort of funny that later on in my career, when I came to Detroit, the Guidepost magazine had a piece about me, and they mentioned Mrs. Lackland, and some of her pupils down in Albany, Georgia, saw it and showed it to her, and she wrote me a beautiful letter and sent me the program that they used for her recitals, and those pupils of hers were still reciting the same poems that we had done back in the early 1930s.
And little did she realize that the house by the side of the road would be made even more famous by you.
Yeah, one of my so-called signature phrases, I guess. When a guy takes the third strike, he stood there like the house by the side of the road and watched it go by. And here is a rendition of The House by the Side of the Road. There are hermit souls that live withdrawn in the place of their self-content. There are souls like stars that dwell apart in a fellowless firmament. There are pioneer souls that blaze their paths where highways never ran. But let me live by the side of the road and be a friend to man. Let me live in a house by the side of the road where the race of men go by, the men who are good and the men who are bad, as good and as bad as I. I would not sit in the scorner's seat or hurl the cynic's ban. Let me live in a house by the side of the road and be a friend to man.
That, of course, brought on a whole new set of friends, and the games that everybody played in those days, stickball if you didn't have a good bat or things like that, and, of course, you became involved in so much of that, I'm sure.
Oh, I certainly did. I love baseball. My dad was a great baseball fan, and he inculcated in me the love of baseball. And baseball was certainly the premier sport around there at that time. We did have a good football with Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia. but my interest was devoted mostly to baseball. And, of course, the summertime was a long time, and we could have our sandlot games. We could choose up sides and play on the vacant lots around the neighborhood, and we had a great time.
How cognizant were you of the major leagues and of the players of that day?
I knew a little bit about the major leagues. I think my focus was on the Atlanta Crackers, a local team, which was in a minor league, the Southern League, but they played pretty good ball. And my heroes were really the Cracker players. And then on the side, I rooted maybe for teams in the major leagues. I was pretty much a National League fan at that time. The St. Louis Cardinals were my team. And if I had a team in the American League, it probably would have been the Detroit Tigers, or it would have been anybody but the Yankees, because remember, General Sherman came to Atlanta previously and got a little careless with matches down there.
Talk a little bit about the Atlanta Crackers and something about their history, because before Atlanta ever had Major League Baseball, they had a reputation as being a baseball town.
The Crackers had started back in the 1880s, in the early days of professional baseball, and had lasted for a long, long time. We're talking about the 30s now, when I really got interested in the Atlanta Crackers. And these guys were heroes of mine. They were bigger than life, and I can remember I'd be thinking about if they were in Chattanooga, what would the guys in the hotel be doing, and what time would they get to the ballpark, and how would they get there. And I was the bat boy at one time for the visiting teams that came to old Ponce de Leon Park. I was also the bat boy for the Crackers once in a while if the regular bat boy couldn't make it. And I never got paid anything. They'd give me old rough-up baseball, and that was about all I expected. But it was sort of like living out a dream for a kid 10, 11, 12 years old at that time to be out at Ponce de Leon Park and playing catch with his heroes or shagging in the outfield.
Did you have any aspirations of playing at a higher level?
I didn't play in high school because I was working all the time, but I did play American Legion ball, which was sort of a forerunner of the Little Leagues, and up to 17 years old was the age limit there. And our team went the city finals, which was pretty good because Atlanta was very hot for American Legion, and we had a lot of teams competing, but we lost out to the Grant Park team in the finals.
Your baseball love put you in contact with one of the greats of all time, Babe Ruth.
Well, that was one of the highlights of my younger days, I think. The Yankees came north from training in Florida, and they were playing the Atlanta Crackers, an afternoon game at old Ponce de Leon Park. About the eighth inning, I sneaked down toward the box seats, right by the Yankee dugout. Babe Ruth was playing right field. When the inning was over, he came in, and as he approached the dugout, I got up at the railing, and I shouted to him, and I said, Mr. Ruth, can I have your autograph? And I was so stupid, I didn't have anything for him to sign. He said, well, kid, you ain't got anything for me to sign on. I said, well, I've got a pen, and then I stuck my tennis shoe over the railing, and I said, well, will you please sign my shoe? So Babe Ruth signed my shoe.
In those days, autographs and autographed memorabilia did not command the high respect that they do today. If it had, you would have not worn that pair of shoes again, and they would have not been worn out.
Well, I wore the shoes because I had to. I didn't want to go barefooted all the time, and probably the only pair of shoes I had. So eventually they were tossed aside, and Babe Ruth's signature went with them.
Now, we've talked about the entrepreneurship of you with sports. That got you into your first job, not as a broadcaster, but as a writer with one of the most prestigious publications in the country, and that's the Sporting News. Take us back to those days and how you got this job.
The Sporting News was really the paper that I looked forward to every week because in those days, the Sporting News covered every league in baseball. Baseball had subsidized the printing of the box scores, and if you had a friend who was playing in the Cotton State League, you could look in there and look for his name in the box score, and it would be there. And each city had a correspondent. And the major leagues, of course, were featured. H.G. Salsinger in Detroit, Dan Daniel in New York, Irvin Vaughn in Chicago. And I was a great fan. I loved the Sporting News. So I decided, well, I'm a big Cracker fan. I'm going to sit down and volunteer to be the Atlanta correspondent. So I sent a letter off to the editor, and he sent a letter back saying, well, you send some stuff in, and if it's okay, you've got the job. he didn't know I was only 16 years old and that I was in high school. So I sent some stuff in, and they printed it, and he gave me the job, and my first article in the Sporting News came out in August of 1934. And from then on, I had an association with that publication that lasted even into the 60s.
Do you remember that first column that you wrote for Sporting News?
I remember a little bit about the first item I sent in. I remember that Wilbert Robinson, who had been the president of the Atlanta Crackers, the old Brooklyn manager, and the old Baltimore Oriole back in the 1890s, who was a great friend of John McGraw, and he had just died before I wrote the first article, and I made a reference to that, and then the rest of the article was more or less about how the team was faring there in mid-August.
Now, this was 1934, but 8 years earlier, you got your first taste, I guess, of radio. Now, this was not on a transistor radio, as we've alluded to earlier, because they didn't come along until the late 50s. It was not on the computer or not on the stereo system, but it was on an old crystal radio set with the cat's whiskers.
Crystal radio set was pretty primitive, I tell you. My brother Davis had one down in the basement of our home on Westminster Drive in Atlanta, and the World Series had never really been broadcast in the true sense of the word very much. And in 1926, Graham McNamee came on NBC, which was a brand new network at that time, and broadcast the World Series between the New York Yankees and the St. Louis Cardinals. And it went into the seventh game, and I was a great Cardinal fan because I rooted against the Yankees, and they came to the seventh and final game, and Tony Lazzari comes to bat in the seventh inning, and they bring in Grover Cleveland Alexander, the old pitcher, and he strikes out Tony Lazzari, which was a key event of that World Series in 1926. And that's probably the first baseball broadcast that I ever heard. We might have had local broadcasts in Atlanta, but I don't remember listening at that stage of my boyhood. But that was a big thrill for me, and it really cemented my interest in baseball and enhanced it. And I still remember Graham McNamee broadcasting that series.
From these beginnings with the Sporting News and getting your first taste of radio, WSB, the powerhouse station of the Southeast.
WSB was a great station, and I was at Emory in 1939. In 1940, I graduated, and in the early spring, right before graduation, I thought I was going to get a job on the newspaper. I thought maybe the Constitution could use me, and if not, maybe one of the other papers in Atlanta. And that was really my ambition, to be a sports writer. I'd been the sports editor of the Emory Wheel, the paper, and also the editor later on. And what happened was we had a fellow named Marcus Bartlett, who was the program director of WSB. He was going to school there, and he came to me one Saturday at a track meet and said, "We want to talk to you about a job at the radio station." So I went down there, and I found out they were looking for a sports announcer. Ed Danforth, the sports editor of the Atlanta Journal, had this program, and he was going to stop, and they needed somebody to replace Ed. So I got in the studio, and they were back in another room, and one of the executives there said, "Now, here's a newspaper. You look at the box scores and ad-lib a little bit about it and tell us what happened." So I did that, and they came in and said, "Well, it sounded pretty good, but we'd like for you to come back next Monday and take the results of the Sunday game and write up a program and deliver it for us." So I did that. And doggone if they didn't give me the job. I hardly had time to get nervous about it. So I started out as a sports announcer at WSB in Atlanta.
The sports director, so to speak, with a one-man staff.
Right, that's it. I was a sports director, but I had to direct myself.
But the nice thing about doing something like this is you got to do what the listeners of sport really wanted to hear. And you, being a sports fan all your life, knew as much as anybody else about that.
Yeah, and I think the idea was that, instead of writing it, I was talking it, and I had really trained myself maybe to be a sports writer, so my background probably helped me a little bit, and they didn't mind my voice too much. Generally speaking, at WSB, which was, right there in the middle of the South, if you had a Southern accent, it was pretty hard to get a job as an announcer. They liked these neutral sort of an accent, you either sounded like a Californian or New Yorker if you're going to get a job on a radio station. But in sports, I guess they didn't care as much, so I got by with it.
the old adage, it's not so much the voice as the content.
Oh, I think so. I think most people are interested in what you know and how you explain what you know. They want somebody that speaks with some authority, and they want a general coverage about what's going on. And if you speak pretty well, that's okay. But as long as you're understood, that's the main idea.
You brought something, though, to these sportscasts that had not been done prior to that. Not just capsulizing what had happened the day before, but interviewing the sports makers of the day. How did you start that?
Well, I figured the people would like to hear what Ted Williams or Hugh Casey or Cecil Travis or some of those great ball players would like to say. So interviewing became a regular process on the show. And also I did a lot of feature stories. I would dig in. I'd go down the library and look up stuff and maybe talk to somebody. And I built a file that way of what I wrote, and I'd keep it, and then I'd restructure it some other time, make a different lead on it in a couple of years, and make a different story. But the basis of the show was results, interviews, and features.
Given the technology of the day, doing an interview was not picking up the phone and calling someone or putting a small cassette tape recorder in front of them and recording it. What was it like?
Well, Bob, it was a lot more complicated, I'd say. We had studios in the Biltmore Hotel. WSB did. That was a little ways outside of what was then downtown Atlanta. And what would happen, for instance, I remember when Ted Williams came out, he got a cab to the station, came up on the elevator to the 10th or 11th floor where the studios were, and we had to do the show live, and then he got a cab back and probably had interrupted his dinner hour. And I was so stupid about things then, I didn't even give him any money. I didn't even give him cab fare. And today, you're lucky if you can stick a little portable recorder underneath a guy's nose at the ballpark and get him to do it for you. And then you got to give him a pair of shoes or $100 or $200 or whatever. But times were different then.
Much different. You didn't have to go through agents and things like that to arrange an interview to be able to talk to a player.
Well, I think what happened a lot of times with the baseball teams when they came north, probably the traveling secretary or the PR guy, if they had one, said, hey, kid, you got to go out and be on this show with this guy whether you want to or not. And he didn't ask any questions in those days like they do now. They just went ahead and did it.
To go to do a remote interview, what did that involve?
It involved a whole lot. What we called a remote would be to get in a truck, and they'd have a big console on the truck. Actually, they'd have a needle that would go in a piece of acetate, and it was like cutting a Victrola record, what we'd call later on an album. And you had to take the truck with you, and usually the guy had to come out to the truck and do it, or they'd have to take this big console and put it in the corner of maybe a hotel lobby or somewhere. That's the way I did an interview with Connie Mack at the Ansley Hotel in Atlanta in 1940.
Mr. Mack, you've had some great stars on all your ball clubs, and I'd like now to ask you to name an all-star team, picking out one man for each position of stars that have been under your managerial duties. Let's start at first base and go around.
After all, it's a great deal a matter of opinion.
Right.
When we talk about great players, you can pick out 30 or 40 of the most wonderful pitchers in the world and that we've ever had. And still there'll be a question of an opinion as to who was the best pitcher. I've always claimed that Christian Madison was the greatest pitcher of all time, but my players disagree with me. They all say that Walter Johnson was the greatest pitcher. But why say Walter Johnson when there were about 30 others that were practically as good, and that other people would have it in the opinion that they were even better than Walter Johnson was?
Who was your first interview with?
I don't remember. I started in May of 1940. I remember I did Jack Dempsey early in my career. Jack had come into town because he was going to referee a wrestling match, and I remember waiting for him, and that was another problem we had. We never knew whether a guy was going to show up because it was a live show. And Jack was a little bit late. We went on at 6:15 and went off at 6:30, and now it got to be about 6:21 or 6:22, and Mr. Dempsey hadn't showed up, but he finally comes in and we do the interview. And I remember asking him, he had a book out, an autobiography, My Life by Jack Dempsey. And I said, how's the book going? He said, I don't know. I haven't read it yet.
Jack Dempsey, just one of the great names that paraded through WSB before your sports microphones, the likes of Bobby Jones and the Georgia Peach, a man that many people have called the meanest of them all, but you had a different perspective of him, didn't you?
I sure did with Ty Cobb. I heard that Ty was coming down to his hometown, Royston, and I decided it might be good if I went down there and interviewed him. And the people at WSB, the executives, didn't like the idea too much. They said, well, he's a mean old man, and he's not going to talk to a kid announcer like you, but if you want to go ahead. So we took this engineer on the truck, took the big console down there to record, and I went up to Cobb's residence, and he came to the door. He was very pleasant, said, come on in. We sat down there on the sofa, and the 15-minute show was completely filled with Ty Cobb. I had no problem at all with him. He was very hospitable. He was very cordial and very warm to me, and I made a good friend there. I used to see him from time to time then on, and I must have been with him 7 or 8 or 10 times after that first interview, and he was always a very cordial gentleman.
What a baseball player.
He was the greatest, I think, for a long, long time. Babe Ruth might have exceeded him because of his pitching prowess, but Cobb was Mr. Baseball, certainly from around 1906 up until the Babe came to the Yankees.
Cobb was one of those that maybe is the embodiment of desire, of competitiveness. He wouldn't lose.
Well, you're right about that, Bob. He had competition to the ultimate, no question about that. He would do anything to win. Some people accused him of dirty tricks, and I imagine from time to time he did pull a few, but he was a real genius in spikes. And I remember we had a bat boy at Tiger Stadium named Eddie Forster, who had been a bat boy when Ty was in his heyday. And Eddie was also the delivery boy for the butcher near the ballpark. And Mrs. Cobb ordered some meat one time. They were going to have company on a Sunday evening. And Eddie delivered the meat, but the Cobbs weren't home, so he put it inside the screen door. And when the Cobbs came home, the meat was there, but it had spoiled. So old Tyrus Raymond Cobb, he didn't get on the phone or anything else. He went right down to the butcher shop and beat the so-called whatever out of the butcher.
They called him the greatest hitter ever, had the best batting eye ever, the Splendid Splinter. Ted Williams was your guest many times. You knew him in a great many avenues. Tell me about Ted Williams and what made him the great hitter that he was.
I really love Ted Williams. He's one of my all-time favorites, and I think what made him a great hitter was the fact that he focused on hitting all the time. He would come to the ballpark, and he'd talk to the other players about certain pitchers. He'd even talk to radio announcers, who didn't know much about it. And he had a feud going on with the media, especially the print guys, because they were sort of mean and nasty to him in Boston when he first reported, and I think it turned him off. But we always got along great. I loved Ted Williams, and he was good to me. I remember in Baltimore one time when I was working for the Orioles were paying tribute to Ted on one of his last go-rounds with the Boston Red Sox, and he knew he was going to have to make a speech, so he wrote something out, and he came to me during batting practice. He said, when we get through here, come on in the clubhouse. I want you to look over my speech and see what you think about it. I looked it over, and it was just right. He had a great intelligence about things, and he knew exactly what he was after. And whatever he went into, he was very thorough. For instance, he took up fishing and became a great fisherman. He was on our Veterans Committee, and when we discussed different players, he had more facts and more statistics about them and knew more about these guys. Plus, he had played for and against a lot of them, so he was a very valued member of the Veterans Committee. And also, he was a real man's man. He was a great Marine flyer. He was a hero. He gave up a lot of his baseball time to be in the service. And he was a great patriot. I did a lot of interviews with Ted Williams and how he loved to talk about hitting.
Here's Hall of Famer Ted Williams Ted, Babe Ruth had his nemesis, Hub Pruitt. Did you ever have one? Anybody ever get you out in the big leagues with any regularity?
Well, that's the difference between he and I. He only had one. I had an awful lot of them. It'd take me a long time to tell you. There's probably 20 pitchers that I could name that were really tough. It wasn't a matter of striking out, but I never could get a hold of their ball consistently as well as some of the others.
Any special type pitcher? Any guy that was more effective than any
No,
other?
it's a funny thing. In my book that I wrote on hitting, I mentioned 5 pitchers in the book. One was a cute little left-hander, kept it outside and good breaking stuff. Another one was a knuckleball pitcher.
Mm-hmm.
And another one had a sinking fastball that I could never quite get a hold of. That type of pitcher. I would think that a hard sinking ball pitcher, day in and day out, was toughest.
Now, what was the hardest pitch for you to hit?
And a knuckleball.
Mm-hmm.
Hardest ball for me to hit?
Yeah.
I think the hardest ball for me to hit was what the hardest ball for any hitter. A good, hard, quick breaking ball is a tougher pitch than the fastest fastball. Yeah. For me, it was.
Now, what's the biggest mistake that most young hitters make when they come to the major leagues?
Well, funny thing, I saw a shot of the 3 outstanding pitchers last year.
Mm-hmm.
One was the rookie pitcher, one was a Cy Young winner, and one was something else, special year he had. And they showed the picture of him pitching, just a little insert of pitching.
Mm-hmm.
All of them threw the ball in the dirt, and the hitters swung at every damn one of them. Mm-hmm. So getting a good ball to hit is all important, because I couldn't have hit some of the pitches they were swinging at.
Of all the guys you talked to about hitting, was there any one particular guy that helped you the most?
Well, I asked so many hitters in my life, great hitters ahead of me, that I thought that could say something that just might trigger something. I thought Hornsby gave me probably the greatest single advice. You got to get a good ball to hit. Mm-hmm. I can't hit that one up here high in height, and I can't hit that blowing away off the plate, or I can't hit a ball that fools me. Mm-hmm. So getting a good ball to hit means all that. A ball in a good spot, ball does not fool you. Then, that's when you got to concede to the pitcher. And you say, I've got 2 strikes. I've got to do something just a little quicker, a little tightening up. A choke up an inch is probably the best advice, and don't try to pull the ball.
Yeah. How about ballparks? You liked Detroit, didn't you?
I love Detroit, but you know, it's a funny thing. They had a challenging type of pitching staff there. Mm-hmm. They had guys that always thought they could get you out, and they were more challenging than they should have been with me at times, I thought. And still, I went to other parks, like Yankee Stadium, and boy, they didn't ever give in to me. They were always out there. If he gets he's going to swing, you're going to hit at that, or we ain't going to swing. And I walked more times in Yankee Stadium than any other ballpark. I had an inviting park in Detroit, and I got enough pitches that I hit well there.
What about Fenway?
Fenway had one great advantage for me, is that we had the right-hand hitting club and still a long right field fence. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, geez, it's a matter of pitching to him with a long right field or pitching these other guys at short left field. So I got a lot of more chances to hit there at times. And I felt I hit better in Fenway than any other park. I hit 333 in the road, I hit 360 something in Boston.
Ted Williams, thanks for being our guest.
Was service ball pretty good when you consider there were a lot of major leaguers who were in service? Did that many of them actually play for the service teams?
It was good baseball, probably as good, if not better, than the baseball in the major leagues back in the States at that time. In Pearl Harbor, for instance, and in Guam, there were some great teams made up maybe 4 or 5 major leaguers on each team, some of them big stars that played.
Some folks say because this wealth of talent left the major leagues for several years to go to the service, that Major League Baseball suffered in the process, that the talent was not quite as good. Do you agree with that?
I agree with part of it, Bob. I think the talent wasn't as good. I think that's pretty much a given, but I don't think baseball suffered as much as most industries or businesses did because they had the green light from President Roosevelt in a letter to Commissioner Landis to go ahead and continue baseball because the president thought it was a great thing that people could get the war off their minds by rooting for a baseball team or listening to the radio of a baseball broadcast. And it's certainly true that the quality of play was not the same because the majority of the stars had left for the service. But on the other hand, as long as the competition was level, I think the interest stayed up. And I think that's the way most people who rooted in the wartime felt because they still had their teams to root for. Night baseball had been cut out because of the problem of security. And the players just weren't as good as the ones who had left. But it still maintained its interest, and except for the cancellation of the All-Star game, it kept on. They still played the World Series.
But that was an era of patriotism, and it wasn't just the grassroots, the everyday man. It was the high-profile people. This was a duty. This was an honor for them, wasn't it?
It was. Everybody was called, and just about everybody responded. I think you found that not only in baseball, but in all the other sports, plus in the film industry and the stage and everywhere. People volunteered because they had a feeling that we had to be unified against the enemy. And that's what happened. They gave up their careers, and a lot of them gave up their lives for the cause.
That even went into the broadcast booth as you were a member of a Marine unit that was called up yourself. How'd you get involved in the Marines to begin with?
I got involved in the Marines because I didn't want to get drafted. It was sort of funny. I was going to get married. Lulu Tankersley and I had planned a marriage, and the head of the draft board there in Atlanta had been the dean of men at Emory University, and I knew him, and I went to him and I said, look, I want to find out about this. I really don't want to get married if I'm going to get drafted anytime soon. And he said, well, don't worry about it. You won't get drafted for probably a year or so. If I were you, I'd go ahead and get married. So we got married in late August of 1941. And then in about 3 weeks, I'm 1A. I'm going to get drafted. So I decided to volunteer for the Marines. And they took me, and I went to the Marines. I went to Paris Island and went through the usual. Then they sent me back to Atlanta for a while. And then I went to Camp Lejeune and had a very miraculous experience there. I was in the 59th Replacement Battalion, and we were in Tent City ready to go overseas. And we were going overseas on a Monday, and my wife Lula came up to say goodbye and spend the final weekend with me. And Friday afternoon, the battalion got orders for me and another Marine to be taken out of the 59th Replacement Battalion and sent to the camp headquarters where we would work on the Globe, the Camp Lejeune paper. I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't put in for it. I was ready to go overseas. But somehow this happened, and I was taken out of the 59th Battalion. Lulu came to say goodbye. We found out about that. The 59th Battalion went overseas. They were not trained quite properly, and just about everybody in the battalion got wiped out on one of those God-forsaken rocks out in the Pacific. And it was only God's hand in that created this miracle for me to escape that. So I have never forgotten that. That was probably the greatest thing that happened to me when I was in the Marines.
From there, the Leatherneck, the Marine publication, you are heavily involved in that, and that brought some interesting interview possibilities as well.
My photographer was John Jalocki, and we didn't live in the barracks except for a couple of days. We met an insurance man there in Tientsin, China, Felix Shaw, and he said, why don't you guys come live in my office and we'll give you 4 or 5 boys to run errands for you. So we lived there and slept on a couple of cots in this guy's office, and we decided that Leatherneck could use a story sort of like Life magazine used to run, Life Goes to a Party. And we had a Marine on liberty in Peking, which is now Beijing, of course. So we went up there and had to get a date for this guy. So no self-respecting Chinese girl wanted, number one, to have her picture taken or go out with a Marine at that point. So we didn't know what to do. So Mr. Shaw said, well, why don't you guys go to this house of prostitution and we'll pick up a couple of girls, and you can say what you want to in the story about them. So the girls would come in, and the photographer, Jaloki, would say, oh, she's too fat. Of course, in English, they didn't understand. She's too ugly. We can't use her. Well, we finally picked two girls, and we had a picture of Red. Red somebody was the Marine that was having this date. So he had these two girls on his arm, and they were coming down the steps of some building that we had found. And in the caption underneath, we wrote that these were two society girls of China who were going to date Red on this Liberty. And in a couple of months, the story came out about Red and Liberty and taking these girls around and seeing all the sights. But the problem was that some of the old Marines that saw this picture told me, said, we knew those were prostitutes because they had certain slit or something in the bottom of their skirts, and we could tell that that's the prostitute's uniform. So I was sort of stymied by that. But that was a wartime literary efforts, I guess.
August 1945, the war, for all intents and purposes, comes to an end. What happens then to Ernie Harwell?
When the war was over, I came back to Atlanta, and housing was very tough. We had to live with my folks, and I went back to my radio station, WSB. The governmental regulation was that you had to get your job back if you'd served. And I went back, and I had an idea, though, that I really didn't want to go back because I'd never done a whole lot of play-by-play at WSB. I'd done the Masters Golf Tournament, I'd done a little football, but I'd never done my sport that I loved so much. I'd never done baseball. And I thought it might be something that I could land if I came back in freelance. So I went to WSB as sort of a final going over with them and asked them would they be interested in me coming back and so forth. They said, yeah, but we can't give you anything but a real late show in sport because we're so jammed up. And I said, well, I think I'll go ahead and freelance.
Let's go back to 1942, the Masters Golf Tournament in Augusta. How did you get involved with that?
Well, the Masters was beginning to get prominent. It didn't have the great attractiveness that it has now, but it had been going on. It was a great tournament that Bobby Jones was still playing in, and that was the chief attraction. And I'd been down to the Masters in 1941 just doing a show there. In the spring of 1942, I was in the newsroom at WSB, and the program director, Marcus Bartlett, came in and said, we just got a wire from NBC, and they want you to work the Masters with Bill Stern. And I was thrilled to pieces because Bill Stern was the number one announcer in sports in the country. He was a big star of the sports. He was Kurt Gowdy and Howard Cosell and Chris Schenkel and Joe Buck, and everybody rolled into one at that time. And NBC was the most prominent network, and this was going to be the first time they'd ever broadcast the Masters Golf Tournament. So I was just ecstatic about getting the assignment, and I knew a little bit about golf. I'd played it like anybody else, and I'd followed it through the papers, but I was far from a golf expert. So I decided that, well, maybe I better learn a little bit more about golf. And to do that, I called on a good friend of mine named O.B. Keeler. O.B. Keeler was the outstanding golf writer of the world at that time. He'd covered every tournament Bob Jones had ever played in. He'd written all the books Bobby Jones supposedly wrote, and he was an international expert. He lived in Atlanta, and I went out to his home and called on him and sat down and started talking to Pop Keeler, that's what we called him, and his wife, who was also a golf writer, Mrs. Keeler. Everybody called her Mom, and she was over in the corner, and she was knitting, and I sat there with Pop, and I said, I'm going to do the Masters, and I want your help, and so forth, and we began to talk, and this and that, sort of a friendly opening-type conversation. And finally, a Mom popped up and interrupted us, looked up from her knitting, and she said, O.B., do you mean to tell me that NBC, the number one network, is going to use this young man just out of college who doesn't know anything about golf to broadcast on the Masters with Bill Stern? Well, you can imagine how my confidence began to ooze out. I didn't have much anyway, and what little bit I had began to ooze out on the floor, believe me. I was super embarrassed by that interruption on the part of Mom. But Pop came to the rescue. He was such a gentle, wonderful kind of a guy. He reached over and put his hand on my knee, and he said, "Son, can you count to 5?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Don't worry about the Masters. You'll be fine. You'll have no trouble at all."
All right, fast forward now to your return to WSB. You got a second chance at the Masters.
Yeah, we
Stern.
got a second chance with Bill Stern, and this one turned out to be quite different. But it really taught me a great lesson, I think. Stern called on me again because we'd had a successful situation the first time that we worked together. He said, "I want you to come back. We're going to use Bob Stanton and you again," and so forth. And the problem was that he changed the modus operandi. He said, instead of the announcer on the fairway calling in, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to open the show, and I'm going to take it for 1 minute, and then I'm going to switch to you after 1 minute. And I'm down on the third green. And Bill Stern opens the show with that great dramatic voice of his, and he goes on, but he didn't go on for a minute. He goes on for about 2.5 minutes. Well, by the time he switches to me, the people that I was supposed to broadcast the play-by-play, Lawson Little and Bobby Jones, they're playing together, they have already putted out on that green. So I'm standing there with nobody around. The two golfers have left, the gallery has left, and I'm supposed to do play-by-play. Well, I come on and I tell exactly what happened. That Lawson has done this and Bob has done this, and now they're on the next tee and they've hit and going down the fairway, and then I start to follow them. And I sound like Whirlaway, coming around the bend because I'm losing my breath. I'm talking at the same time. I'm trying to get through the crowd. And in those days, I had no security, anything. It was just sort of a big party for all the golfers. And so I finally get up on the green, and I'm able to catch up with them and do the play-by-play on the next green. I did the best I could under the circumstances. And Stern called back and said, "Ernie, that's not going to do. We're going to have to replace you," just like that. And I was crestfallen, Here was my big chance again to be on the network, and I'd been a failure, no question about it. He said, "I'm going to send another guy out there to take your place." So he did, and I went back, and I said, "I'm sorry." And he said, "Well, what you should have done, you should have recreated. You should have gone ahead and done the play-by-play, even though those guys were on the next hole. Or you should have stopped them and interviewed them." Well, in those days, nobody ever stopped a golfer and interviewed them. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to fake it. I'm just not going to do that." And he said, "Well, you're too nice a guy. You'll never get anywhere in radio. Don't worry about it." So I got on the bus and I went home to Atlanta. Naturally, I was very disappointed in my performance. But a lot of people didn't pay much attention. I had some guys say, "Hey, you did a great job on the Masters." And I found out one thing, that you think there are a lot more people listening and a lot more people interested in your broadcast than there really are. And I also discovered that about all you can do is do your broadcast, do your best, and let it go at that.
All right, the Atlanta Crackers. You're going to get your first chance to do play-by-play. What did you do to get ready for your first broadcast?
Well, to begin with, the problem with my first broadcast, I didn't know whether there'd ever be one or not, because when I was in the Marines, I'd done maybe 1 or 2 games for Earl Mann, the owner of the team. He'd asked me to maybe fill in. They couldn't find an announcer. And I said, "Well, I don't really want to do it in uniform, but if you clear it with a colonel, I'll do it, and I'll give my check to the Red Cross." I didn't feel like I should do it, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And he told me then, he said, "If you ever get out of the service, I want you to be my announcer." So I was sort of basing my future on that promise to some degree, although I know a lot of things can happen. Well, what happened was that Wheaties bought the games on the radio station. The radio station had a good sports announcer named Stan Raymond, and they wanted to use him because, number one, he was established as their announcer on their staff, and number two, they wouldn't have to pay anything extra. I told Earl Mann about the problem, and he said, "Well, Wheaties and WATL, they probably want to use Stan Raymond. But I tell you what, I'm going to give him a battle because I made you this promise, and I'm going to give you a battle." So the thing went back and forth for a long, long time, and a month or so before the season starts, I still don't know. Now we get up to a couple of weeks before I still don't know. Now the last week before the opening game, I don't know. And now we finally get up to the day before the opening game. And Earl Mann calls and says, "I'm going to hold out for you as much as I can." Well, I figured, in most cases in that situation in radio, the guy would say, "Well, Ernie, I did my best, and I'm sorry that we couldn't do it any better." Earl Mann hung on, and he finally called me the morning of opening day. And he says, come on down, you're going to be my announcer. So I really didn't have much time to get ready. But I love baseball so much, it was sort of natural for me. And I never had any real problems doing play-by-play. I did it the best I could. And my idea was I'm going to tell these people what I would like to hear if I were a listener. And I just did it that way, and it seemed to work okay.
The first walk-off, Tommy Thompson. Put a man on first, nobody down. And Hal Jeffcoat, who has a single in one trip, is the batter. He had the first hit off Thompson. A bouncing ball over the hill in the first inning. Jeffcoat hitting .366. Here's a pitch. Fastball, strike one call. Right down the middle, about belt high. No balls and one strike on Hal Jeffcoat. 45 RBIs for this fella during the season. Outfield deep to left. Here's a pitch. Fastball slammed down to first base. Duquella catches and touches at the bag. Double play. That one rocketed off the bat of Hal Jeffcoat and direct into the hands of Vic Duquella at first base. Vic snagged the ball. It was just a matter of reflex and stepped on the bag for the double play. And that is the 60th double play for the Crackers this season.
Radio advertising and sponsorships in television has changed so much over the years because when you started doing those Atlanta Crackers games, Wheaties was the entire sponsor. They had it in its entirety.
Wheaties was the sponsor, no question about that. They sponsored, I'd say, 90 different broadcasts, some of them minor leagues and some of them in the major leagues. And they even had a little trade paper about broadcasting, and they would bring in the broadcasters to a convention once a year, talk about the techniques of announcing, how to do the commercials. And during the first season that I worked for Wheaties, the company made us write our own commercials for 1 week. We had to do a commercial every half inning, and we had to write a different commercial for each half inning. So they made us do a lot of things that were a little bit extra from just announcing. But it was a great outfit. General Mills had an idea about marketing that was excellent. And also, they had a good product, and it was wonderful to work for Wheaties.
So not only did you have to do the games, you also had to read the commercials that you yourself had written. Did you have to get that copy approved by General Mills?
No, you didn't. You just did it, and they trusted you, and you winged it.
All right, let's go back to the Cracker games. You got that first one under your belt. Did you have a feeling of accomplishment or a rival? I've done it, now I are one?
I think, Bob, what happened was I had done a game and I was glad the first one was over. And I think I got through it okay. It seemed to be all right. The reaction was favorable. But I knew that I was going to have to get better. And I made an intense study about what I wanted to do. And I began to collect anecdotes that I could use, put them down on the index cards, and to use that throughout my broadcasting career. I also had the idea that I would get the information about each player. And in the Southern League in 1946, there was no such thing as a PR man. You didn't even get a roster from the teams. You had to get the stats that you did get out of the Sunday paper, which went through the Thursday games. So I would get them out of the Sunday paper, then I'd bring them up to date as the games went on. And to get information about a player, I'd go down to the hotel, and as the players would come into the lobby, I'd collar them, and we'd sit down there, and I'd take out my index cards, and I'd say, how tall are you, what do you weigh, where do you live, and what do you do in the off-season? And also, where did you play last year, and where did you start? Now, they give you these books, and all that stuff is automatic, so you don't have to worry about it. But in those days, you had to dig for every fact that you got.
Wow. You had to be not only your play-by-play man, you had to be an advertising man, a copywriter, a public relations director for both teams, a statistician. When did you have time to sleep?
At the same time I was doing the Cracker games, I was doing a Major League Game of the Week on WAGA. We get a telegraphic report, maybe of the Cub-Cardinal game in St. Louis. I'd be in the studio at WAGA in Atlanta, and I'd recreate the game that afternoon. Then I might go out to Ponce de Leon Park that night and do a doubleheader live. But you didn't mind that. You enjoyed it, you know. It's part of the business, and you love what you were doing.
Now, you mentioned the word recreation. There may be a lot of people who have absolutely no idea what it means to recreate a ball game. Take me through it.
That was a fairly common process back until, I'd say, in the major leagues, recreation went out around 1952 or 3. Pittsburgh Pirates were the last broadcast team to do recreation. But basically, what an announcer did on a recreation went this way. Let's say the Atlanta Crackers were playing the Birmingham Barons in Birmingham. I'd be in a studio in Atlanta with a telegrapher. He'd have his telegraphic machine, and he'd have a typewriter. He'd have a cohort from Western Union in the press box in Birmingham who'd have the same equipment, and he'd send the dot dashes to my guy in the studio. He would write it down on a typewriter, and he'd write down the play-by-play of the game. Now, generally, the announcer, when he did a recreation, he'd stay maybe an inning or an inning and a half behind because a lot of things would happen. You'd lose a line or something would happen that you couldn't continue, and you'd have to fill. So you wanted a little bit of a cushion to fill with. But what would happen, my telegrapher, he would write out, say, Jones up for Atlanta. He's leading off for Atlanta. He said, Jones up. B1W, that's ball one wide. S1C, strike one call. FLOGS, fouled over the grandstand. And then he'd say, Jones out, short to first. 1 out. That's all you'd get. So the announcer would say, Smith's out there on the mound. He's looking into Brown to get the sign now. The infield's in a little bit. The outfield's around toward left. Now, wait a minute. Jones is going to step out and go back for the rosin bag. Now he's back in the batter's box. Now so-and-so looks in, gets the sign. Here's the windup. Here's the pitch. Ball one outside. A curveball just missed the outside corner. Ball one, the count on him, and then you go through the other pitches and foul one over the grandstand and so forth. And then you'd say, here's the pitch, ground ball, hit to short. Morton is back, he has it. Long throw to first base to Smith, and he's out by a step and a half. Now, all you got was out the shortstop, but you had to sort of be an actor more than you were the announcer. And if you had a lull, like Ronald Reagan told a story at the White House about this, he said he fouled off 17 pitches, you know. They lost their line, the guy fouled off 17 pitches. Or you'd have a dog run on the field. Dog would run on the field and they'd have to call time. Or sometimes you'd get a sprinkle that really didn't happen. And the guys had come back from the road trip and their wives say, what about that dog? Oh, no, that wasn't a dog. What are you talking about? And another thing that would happen, you'd get down to the 9th inning, and the announcer wanted to go home. Now, he was an inning and a half behind, so he'd catch up in a hurry. And usually in the 9th inning, the batters went zam, zam, zam to hit the first pitch, whether they really did or not. But it was a lot of fun, and, you know, there were some guys who could do a real good recreation and couldn't broadcast a live game. And there were others that could do a game live very well, but they couldn't do a good recreation.
You can actually do a better broadcast knowing what has already happened, but did you use sound effects with it?
The only sound effect we had, we took up from the guy who preceded me because people were used to it. When a guy got a hit, we would hit a gong like the NBC gong.
Oh, okay.
Bong, he got a single, we'd give him one. Bong, bong would be a double. And that would create an interest for people that weren't quite listening. You know, they'd hear this and they'd say, well, something's happening. Mm-hmm. But the only thing I had other than that was just slap a ruler on the table, and that was a ball hitting the bat. But some guys had very intricate crowd noise and press box PA. And I know when I worked with Red Barber in Brooklyn, we did some recreations in 1948 and 49, and he didn't use anything. He just gave it as it happened. And there were guys in bars, you know, who could interpret those dots and dashes that you hear in the background, and they'd bet, say, hey, this guy's going to hit a home run. Give me some odds and make a little bar money.
Now, he didn't succeed you in Brooklyn, but there was a company later in Brooklyn in the 50s, because that's how I grew up a Brooklyn fan, who did the recreation with the soundtrack, with the xylophone hammer on a block of wood for a hit. And I wondered why I always heard about every 4 minutes, attaboy, Duke, whether Snyder was at the plate or anything.
That's the old recording. And Nat Albright was that guy, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Nat
absolutely.
did a good job. He had a network down there toward your home in Carolina.
Absolutely. But now, you did not travel with the team at all with Atlanta.
No, not at all.
Did all the home games live,
Mm-hmm.
but the recreation on the road.
We did one road game. It was in 1948. We went to Birmingham, and I thought that was really a big shot, going on the train with the team and getting over there to Birmingham and doing the broadcast direct from Birmingham live. But that's the only time I ever did one. Everything else, I had a picture of the ballpark. I'd say it hit the Coca-Cola sign in right field, something like that. But I'd never seen those parks.
You actually turned down the first major league broadcasting job that you had offered to you, didn't you?
I didn't really turn it down, but I was unable to accept it. I had signed a contract with Old Gold to do the Atlanta Cracker games in '47. And really, I thought I was a big shot now. I finally signed a contract. I'd never even seen a contract before, but I signed. I felt real good. I'm going to do the games. They're going to pay me X number of dollars, and that's great. And then the Giants had an interest in me, the New York Giants, and they sent a guy down and said that they'd like for me to come and broadcast the Giant games with Frank Frisch. Well, Frank had been doing the color with a guy named Ellis, and they wanted to replace him. So I said, wow, I'm going to the big leagues. This is great. But I did have a contract with Old Gold. However, they had agreed, not in writing, but they had agreed that if I got a big league offer, I would be released and I could get out of my contract. So I was very anxious to go, and I found out that they weren't going to let me out of my contract. And I talked to Earl Mann, my patron saint there, the owner of the Crackers, and he said, well, I'm going to do everything I can. I don't want to lose you, but I want you to get to the big leagues. And he said, we'll try to fight this, and I'll talk to them and see if they'll release you, although it's not written into the contract. Well, they wouldn't budge. They said no. So it was very disappointing that I had to stay at least another year and do the Cracker games. I didn't get a chance to go to the big leagues. And that's when Brooklyn came down and scouted me and got me, and then I did go to Brooklyn and work for Old Gold.
You mentioned the Dodgers. They came looking at you. Branch Rickey, who owned the team, was the guy who pulled all the strings. He was an innovator to the nth degree. Give me your recollections of Branch Rickey.
Branch Rickey was about the smartest man I ever saw in baseball. He was ahead of everybody. He was a man who really brought the farm system to fulfillment. He was a guy that first really put paddings on the walls around the ballpark. He was the first executive that insisted that the players wear batting helmets. A lot of things that now we take for granted were innovations brought into the game by Branch Rickey. He was also the best man, as they say, of putting a dollar sign on a muscle. He could look at a guy as a prospect and figure out better than anybody else whether this guy would develop into a true major leaguer. He had success wherever he went. He was probably the most brilliant baseball man that ever ran a front office.
He did have an eye for talent, and it wasn't always on the field. Sometimes it was in the broadcast booth. Unbeknownst to you, he had some of his scouts listening to you do the Atlanta Crackers games.
That's true, and it was quite a surprise to me. I think what happened in relation to Mr. Rickey and me was that, first of all, there was a sports writer named Kyle Crichton, sports editor of the Collier's magazine. He's the father of Michael Crichton, the famous novelist. He came down to do an interview for Collier's with Frankie Sinkwich, the great Georgia football player. And in the process, I guess he heard me broadcast. He went back and told Mr. Rickey about it. And Branch Rickey, I found out just recently, also sent Buzzy Bavasi, who had been the general manager at Montreal, later became the GM at Brooklyn, a lot of other places. He sent him down, and he listened to me. He talked to the cab drivers and the fans and the ball players and people like that, and he sent a report back. And then he had another guy named Arthur Mann, who was sort of an advisor on public relations and media relations, and he came down and talked to me. So I was really surprised that the Branch Rickey took that kind of an interest in me. But he did scout me quite thoroughly.
If anything, Branch Rickey kept things close to the vest. He didn't want anybody knowing what he was doing, nobody messing in his business. That also involved you in your first scheduled meeting, didn't it?
Oh, it sure did. I was contacted by Arthur Mann, the man that I mentioned, and he said, Mr. Rickey wants to meet you at the Battle House in Mobile. He gave me a certain date. He said, can you make it? And I said, yeah, I'll be there. And so I was in spring training in Gainesville with the Crackers. I caught a little puddle jumper, went through a storm, got to the Battle House early in the morning, and we were going to meet about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I was ready. I waited. And Branch Rickey didn't show up. I waited. 5 o'clock's gone, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And I finally got in touch with Arthur Mann. He said, well, Mr. Rickey couldn't get away. He's sorry, but he'll see you sometime probably in Atlanta. So I was very disappointed, and that waiting almost killed me. But I figured something good is going to happen. I got back to Atlanta, and I played that ball for a little guy who was a hunchback named Rach Bell. And he'd been sort of a bird dog scout for Branch Rickey. And one morning at my home in Atlanta, I got this phone call, and the voice said, "I'm not going to tell you who this is, but somebody wants to see you at the Ansley Hotel. He'll be in the coffee shop at 8 a.m. Be there." So I'd heard all these stories about Branch Rickey, how hard he was to talk to and so forth, and what a tough guy he was in negotiating and things like that. I went down to the Ansley Hotel, and I got to the coffee shop, and he was there, and we sat there, and he said, "I've got a plane to catch. I got to get out of here pretty quick, but we'll get to the point." Well, we stayed there about an hour and a half, I guess, and he did all the talking, and I was enthralled by him. I was hypnotized almost, and he told me then that he wanted me to come up to Brooklyn. And the theory at that time was that Red Barber, the chief announcer, was going to have to do the Olympics for CBS Radio. The Olympics that year were in London. And Red was going to have to be gone for maybe a month or 3 weeks, and they would bring me up, and I would take his place while he was gone. Well, later on, they decided they'd do it another way, that they'd have guest announcers come on and be the announcer. They wouldn't need me. In the meantime, in late July, Red Barber got stricken by a bleeding ulcer in Pittsburgh, and I guess that's another story.
But then you ended up going to Brooklyn?
Mm-hmm. What happened was Branch Rickey called Earl Mann, my boss in Atlanta, and said, "I'd like to have Ernie come up and replace Red Barber as my announcer." And Earl Mann said, "Well, Mr. Rickey, that's fine, but I've got Ernie under contract, and if you're serious about that, if you really want him, you're going to have to make a deal with me. You send me your catcher, Cliff Dapper, from Montreal, and you can have Ernie Harwell to announce your game." So I was traded for a minor league catcher.
That has never happened before nor since.
No, I think that's the only time as far as anybody knows.
You go to Brooklyn to do your first game. Was this your first Major League ball game to see?
No, I'd seen a game before in Chicago. Back in 1934, my Uncle Lauren, who lived in Evanston, wanted me to come up because he knew I was a great baseball fan. I had started working with the Sporting News, but I'd never seen a big league ball game. So he brought me up, and the first game that we were scheduled to go see was rained out. And I was so anxious to see a game, I was going crazy. It kept raining, and it rained again the next day. And he said, "Don't worry about it. I know you got a ticket to go home, but we're going to change that ticket, and you're going to stay here. I don't care how long it rains. You're going to stay here, and you're going to see a big league ball game." So finally, we went out to Old Comiskey Park. The Yankees were in town. They were playing the White Sox. Red roughing against Ted Lyons, two great Hall of Fame pitchers. And the Yankees had Babe Ruth playing left field. He made a great running catch in left field. It was his final American League game in Chicago. Lou Gehrig was in the lineup. Lou Gehrig got 2 doubles that afternoon, and he did something I've never seen in my whole broadcasting career. He ducked a pitch. It ricocheted off his bat over the third baseman's head for a 2-bagger. And he did it again the next time up. 2 straight times he got a double the same way.
Trying to get out of the way.
And the Yankees won that game. The crowd was probably about 2,000 or 3,000 people on that September afternoon.
But you remember it well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, you get to Brooklyn. You're replacing Red Barber, a legend as well there with the Dodgers. And what about your first broadcast?
Well, the first broadcast was postponed by rain. I got up there, and they put me up at the Bassett Hotel on Montague Street in Brooklyn. And I didn't know anybody in town, so I've got to wait for the game that night. And doggone if it didn't rain it out, and I don't have anything to do until the next night, so I'm going bananas in this hotel room where I don't know anybody. Well, finally, the next day comes, and in the late afternoon, I get a subway out to Ebbets Field. I really didn't know how to get there, but I got there, and I wandered into the ballpark. I don't know anybody, really, and I haven't had spring training or anything. I'm coming in absolutely cold. The first people I saw were a couple of players from the Southern League, Paul Minner and Russ Meyer, and they said hello, and that made me feel a little bit better. And then the Dodger players were very, very warm and cordial and friendly to me because they knew I was coming into an unusual kind of a situation, replacing Red and just coming in absolutely cold. And they couldn't have been more hospitable. They were great. And I went up to the booth and worked with Connie Desmond, who was a terrific announcer. He'd been Red's partner for several years, had a great voice, and just a great guy. And he was very warm and cordial to me, too. And in the first inning, Jackie Robinson steals home on a pitch by Muck Meyer, and it's a very close play at the plate, and he's called safe. And Muck Meyer is a sort of a very eccentric guy, probably best known for the fact that some girl in the bar bit off his nose one time, the end of his nose. But Muck goes bananas, when Jackie Robinson's called safe at the plate. And he gets profane, he gets obscene, he begins to shout and rage, and his words go over our broadcast. The very first game I'm on. And they're all over the broadcast, and Meyer gets tossed out of the game, which is very unusual for a starting pitcher in the first inning to get ejected. But the umpire tosses him out of the game. He's fined and suspended, and Jackie Robinson steals home. The Dodgers finally win the game, and that was my debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers.
That is almost the fact that your microphones would pick up a player on the field.
Well, what they did then, they had what they call the parabolic microphones. They'd have these mics that would have a little cone around them, a little circle around them, and they direct them right to home plate, usually, so they could hear the crack of the bat and the pop of the mitt and so forth. And it just happened they were on, and I guess they should have cut them off at that time, but nobody thought about that.
And there was no 5-second delay.
No delays in those days.
All right, this stint with Brooklyn, you're there for a couple of weeks replacing Red. What happens when he comes back?
He came back a little sooner than most people anticipated. He was still very weak when he came back. In fact, all the rest of the time I worked with him, his voice was weak, and the engineers had to put up the gain and so he could project over the microphone. But Red came back on a game at the Polo Grounds. The Dodgers were in to face their hated rivals, the New York Giants. It was sort of a murky, halfway rainy day. It was a night game, and it was Red's first time back, so Connie Desmond and I both worked with Red that first game back. And the Giants get a man on first and third with one out in the first inning. It looks like Rex Barney's going to have a hard time. He was a very wild pitcher. Dick Young once said Rex Barney would be in the Hall of Fame if the plate was high and outside. That's how wild he was. He couldn't get the ball over. He had a great arm. And they were warming up a guy in the bullpen. Well, the upshot is that Rex Barney pitches a no-hitter. So it was pretty much of a big occasion for me.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned Jackie Robinson. Everybody has an opinion when that name is brought up. What's the first thing you think of when I say Jackie Robinson?
First thing I think of is a great player who broke the color line in the major leagues, the most important event that's ever happened in sports history. I think about a guy who had a wonderful personality, who was very intelligent, ahead of everybody else, and made the very most of the ability that he had. He was probably a lot better football, basketball, track star than he was a baseball player, but he applied himself so much. He had terrific drive, terrific ambition, and he was the most exciting player that I think ever saw.
Speed, yes, but blinding speed, no. But he had that certain knack. He had the moves. He knew when things were going to happen.
He did have that sense, and he danced off the base, and he would force the opposition into some kind of error. They'd get him in a rundown, and he'd generally be able to get out of it most of the time because in the haste, the second baseman or shortstop would throw the ball away, and he'd go on to the next base and be safe. And he was a great exponent of steal of home. He could do that. He had sort of an awkward swing. He looked like he was tied up in his shoulders when he swung, but he could hit with power. And he made some great clutch plays in the field. He wasn't a great fielder, but he always came up with a big play.
So much has been written and recorded about Jackie and his trials and tribulations, being accepted, number one, by the Brooklyn Dodgers as a team. And that wasn't the most popular move that Branch Rickey ever made. How did the team react to Jackie as you saw it?
Well, the team reacted with mixed feelings at the beginning, but I think Jackie won just about everybody over. I went there in his second year of his breaking the color line, and it was still a problem. He was still getting abused by the fans, getting abused by the opposing players. I think most of the players on his own team had come around by then. In the early going, some of the players had said that they didn't want to play for the Dodgers. They wanted to be traded. Branch Rickey traded several of them, mostly to Pittsburgh. But by the time Jackie had proved that he was a great team man and a great team leader, I think everybody had come around to support his cause. There might have been a few recalcitrant players, but if they were, they kept their mouths shut, and I didn't know about it.
Well, Robinson was subjected to a lot of insults and a lot of other things during his entire career, but it was especially bad in the early going. And there was one incident in 1949. Right after spring training, the Dodgers are headed back north to start the season, and they stop in Atlanta for a 3-game exhibition set with the Atlanta Crackers. And there was a very ugly scene involving the Ku Klux Klan there, wasn't there?
That's right, Bob. It was quite intimidating. The Grand Dragon of the KKK, Dr. Green, had called Earl Mann, the owner of the Atlanta Crackers, and said, "I'm sending you a letter about this subject, but I want you to know that if Jackie Robinson plays at Ponce de Leon Park during this series, he'll be shot by the KKK." And Earl Mann said, "Go to hell." And then he called the police chief, Herbert Jenkins, and reported to him, and they decided to go on with the 3-game series. Well, the Dodgers got to Atlanta for the first game, and Bert Shotton's the manager, and he reads the letter to his players, and he says, "You're going to take the field, and you're going to play." After the threat, they needed a little comic relief. Gene Hermansky, the good-humored outfielder, said, "Why don't we all wear number 42, Jackie's number, and then they won't know which guy to shoot." Then when they got on the field, Pee Wee Reese, his Keystone partner, told Jackie, said, "Move over a little to your right, Jackie. This guy might be a bad shot, and I don't want to get hit." But it was a big cause célèbre there in Atlanta, and it made an impact on me because I was going back to my hometown and broadcasting for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I was sort of in the middle of it. But it went off without any untoward incident at all, and they had a capacity crowd every one of the games, and on the final game they had a record crowd of 25,221. Jackie Robinson played, and he was not shot by the KKK.
I can still remember seeing that picture of Jackie crossing home plate after hitting a home run, and there is the captain of the Dodgers with his hand outstretched, shaking Jackie's hand and slapping him on the back. Was that the defining moment for Jackie, that the white players on the team had accepted him because Pee Wee Reese was their captain?
I think so. I think Pee Wee was admired by everybody and really loved by everybody. He knew that he was going to be a teammate of Jackie Robinson. He came around and was most cordial and warm to Jackie, and they became good friends. And, of course, they were pretty much a Keystone combination there, although Jackie started out as the first baseman in his first few days with the Dodgers. But I think the friendship that he made with Pee Wee was sort of a defining moment for Jackie, yeah.
Pee Wee left his position and walked over to mine while they were doing the riding, and he put his hand on my shoulder as if to say to them, "Go ahead and yell and say what you please. The only thing that matters as far as Pee Wee Reese is concerned is that Jackie Robinson plays as well as he possibly can for the Brooklyn Baseball Club, and that he conducts himself in a manner that makes him worthy of being a member of the team." Another instance was the time that the Philadelphia Phillies came into Brooklyn, and they were quite vicious with their remarks, and they are all directed at me. But the fellows on the ball club resented this more than I think people realized. And the fact that the Phillies continued to ride me, I think, brought our ball club much closer together.
Pee Wee wasn't just called the captain. He was the captain of the Dodgers. It was his team, wasn't it?
It was. He was great. He was a fine fielder, good clutch hitter, great base runner. He didn't steal a lot of bases because in those times the stolen base wasn't a big factor in baseball, but they'd very seldom catch him on an attempted steal. But he could do everything, and I think everybody looked up to Pee Wee.
Baseball fans, when the name Jackie is mentioned, when the name Pee Wee is mentioned, they know who you're talking about. But there are others in those boys of summer. The Duke, Oysk, Skoonge, Big Nuke.
They did have great players, and they got along well. Billy Cox at third base, a lot of people think that he was even better than Brooks Robinson. He was a little skinny guy, but he'd catch everything, hit down there, had a great arm. Then you had Reese and Robinson. Gil Hodges was one of the sweetest guys you ever met, mild-mannered, but He had wrists as big as most guys' thighs, you know. Campanella was a great catcher, could hit the long ball. He had Bruce Edwards behind him. And then they had Hermansky and Snyder. Carl Furillo, the Reading rifle in right field, a guy that Ricky bought the whole ball club at Reading, PA, so he could get Furillo. And in those days, a minor league franchise wasn't as expensive as it is today. But the Brooklyn team had a lot of characters on it. The fans were great. And I was very fortunate to be able to break into the major leagues at Brooklyn. I couldn't believe how nice they were to me, the fans and the listeners, and because I had come up under tough circumstances, and I think they realized that, and they were great to me.
As you saw Robinson's perception, was it different from the media than it was from the teammates and the Brooklyn fans?
I think the media was pretty good with Jackie. I think they might have been hard on him every now and then in New York because the New York writers more or less called it as it was. But they were fair to Jackie, I think. And in those days, you had more of a fraternal feeling between the media and the team. Guys played cards together on the train, and you ate together in the dining room. And you didn't have the gap that you have now between the media and the players, where they're pretty well separated all the time. So it was more of a feeling of friendship in the traveling group than we have today.
Tell me about the train rides.
Train ride was great. They were a lot longer. In a way, it was better to go on the plane and get there right after the game. But generally speaking, you'd have a day game in a certain city and go out and eat dinner somewhere with some of the players and get on the train around 10:30 or 11. Most of the time, we would have an overnight trip and get up the next day, sometimes have breakfast on the train, sometimes get off and go to the hotel immediately and have breakfast there, and then take a little rest and go to the ballpark. And the long trips would be Boston to St. Louis. That would take you a day and a half. Generally, the trips were fairly short and enjoyable. A lot of card playing, a lot of sitting in the observation car and just talking about baseball and whatever came to mind. And the guys seemed to have a lot better feeling about the media, as I said, than they do now.
Who was the best Hearts player on the team?
Pee-wee was really good. I played with him a lot, and I played with Jackie a lot. And Cappy, I played with him a good bit, too. You sort of divided up as you played. Different guys played with different people, and it just happened that way. Every ball club had sort of a different card game. It was blackjack when I went to the Giants, but it was hearts when I was with the Dodgers. But it was fun, and we didn't play for much money. You know, if you lost $10 or $15, you thought it was pretty much of a disaster.
What made the Boys of Summer special?
Well, I think the Boys of Summer were special. Number one, they had great ability. And number two, you had some wonderful personalities on that team. Plus the fact that they were the underdogs all the time, and most of America roots for the underdogs. And either the Yankees or the Giants were their hated rivals. And you had a situation in New York where there were three great baseball teams. And I think for a span of 10 years, somebody pointed out that at least one of the teams was in a World Series just about every year except maybe one. Usually it was the Yankees. Sometimes the Giants would make it. The Dodgers would make it more than the Giants would. But somebody would be there, and the rivalry between the Giants and the Dodgers was so intense that it spilled over from year to year no matter what the personnel was. And when you'd go to the Polo Grounds, that would be about the only time the Giants would draw a crowd. They'd draw 600,000 or 700,000 for the year, and about two-thirds of that would be when they played the Dodgers.
All right, you had the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Giants. What was that like to have three of the premier franchises in baseball all located in that close proximity?
Well, it was fantastic for the fans, and from an announcer's standpoint, it was a great learning process because when you announced for the Dodgers, the Giant fans would tune in and they hated the Dodgers, and the Yankee fans would tune in and they hated the Dodgers. So you had to talk to one group that liked you and the other group that wanted you to lose. So you had to pretty much be down the middle, I'd say. That's the way most of us played it.
You mentioned being down the middle. When you were in Atlanta doing play-by-play, were you down the middle pretty much, or were you a Cracker fan on the air?
I was down the middle even from the beginning. I felt like I had to make up my mind one way or the other. You can either root for the team on the air or you don't, and it was my choice, whether right or wrong, to not root for the team. I felt like that was a prerogative of the fan and let him have it. and not say we or we got to go or come on, guys, let's get some runs. And I felt like I just wanted to be a reporter most of all and let the chips fall where they may.
Jackie broke the color barrier, but very quickly there was an influx, especially on the Dodgers, not only with Campanella, but with Don Newcomb, with Joe Black, and later on Junior Gilliam, Sandy Amorous. The list goes on. Was it easier for those guys that followed Jackie?
Once Jackie had broken the color line, it was a much easier trip for everybody. But Jackie was a pioneer, and a lot of credit is due to him and, of course, Branch Rickey, who conceived the idea and, along with Jackie, made it happen. The old story about Jackie going to Branch Rickey when they first signed is absolutely true, because Branch said, you've got to be able to turn the other cheek to make this experiment a success. And Jackie said, you mean you want a guy without guts enough to fight back? And he said, no, I want a guy with guts enough not to fight back. You've got to swallow your pride a little bit and make it a success by holding off. And for 2 years, Jackie followed that regimen. He held his temper, and he did have a tough temper. And I remember when he finally broke loose, it was a game in Pittsburgh at Forbes Field. He blew his stack about a call, and from then on, he was just a guy playing baseball.
He was carrying this load for 17 million people, and that he had to come under, come to tall, we call it. Mm-hmm. Act thus and so, turn the other cheek was the thing that we discussed at that first meeting at length.
You mentioned Roy Campanella, a great talent whose career and ultimately life was cut way too short.
Well, Roy was a happy-go-lucky guy. Jackie Robinson was pretty serious, you know. Jackie had a cause, and he stuck with it. Roy was just sort of a laissez-faire, whatever happens, don't worry about it. I'm going to go out there and do my best and get my base hits or throw a guy out at second. A great guy to be around, and always had a big smile. He was a smart baseball man. He'd grown up in the Negro Leagues. He'd caught, when he was 14 or 15 years old, caught doubleheaders in those leagues, and he had a tragic end when he skidded on the freeway outside of New York City and was paralyzed. Lived a very tough life from then on. He was on our Veterans Committee later, and it was so sad. He was in a wheelchair all the time, and he could communicate, but it was tough for him, and he wasn't the same old Roy that we knew when he was catching.
I mentioned Don Newcomb, big, tall, strong, hard thrower. What was he like?
I liked Don. He was a good guy. He had an alcoholic problem later on, something I certainly didn't know about in my early days, because he came up my second year. They had a great year in '49 and pitched them to the pennant. He could throw the ball hard. He was a great fastball pitcher, and he was such a big, strong-looking guy. He was intimidating on the mound. I think that was part of his success. Guys didn't want to dig in at the plate against old Nuke. And as Campanella used to say, he could really throw that express, his fastball.
One of the most special guys of that group is the Duke of Flatbush, Duke Snyder.
The Duke was quite a player. When he first came up, he was a left-hand hitter, so he got to see a lot of right-handers at Ebbets Field, which was good. And he struck out a lot at first. But he really found himself and made himself a great outfielder. He was a terrific fielder and a good hitter, could hit the long ball. He was a great clutch hitter, very personable, and a really top-notch person, and later made quite a career out of broadcasting. And I was very proud of the Duke, the way he adjusted to broadcasting after he got through a great baseball career.
Why did the Dodgers win only one world championship in Brooklyn?
I don't know. A lot of guys in Brooklyn have asked that for years, and I sure don't know the answer. I think we could say one word, the Yankees, maybe.
Brooklyn was a special place to live, to be a fan in, and to go to the ballpark at. Because not only was it an unusual ballpark, but it had its cast of characters, shall we say, led by one Miss Hilda Chester.
Oh, Hilda, yeah. Hilda was a great gal. She worked for H.M. Stevens, which was a concessionaire. She was a filler of peanut bags, but she was a great Dodger fan, and she loved Leo DeRocha. Anything that Leo did was all right with her. And she had this cowbell. That was her trademark. And when the Dodgers did something, even if they didn't, she'd be ringing the cowbell. And it almost killed her when Leo left the Dodgers and went across the river to the hated Giants and became the manager of the New York Giants. But we also had the Brooklyn Symphony, led by Shorty Larice, and the symphony was 3 or 4 guys who thought they could play instruments. I think you had a drum and a trumpet and a couple other things. They were at every game. They made a lot of noise. It wasn't too musical most of the time. But when an opposing batter, for instance, would strike out, they would give him a little musical accompaniment back to the bench. Bump the bump, bump the bump, that little tune. And when he sat down, they said, boom. And the opposing player sometimes would try to fool him with a fake sit-down, where they'd play the music and he wouldn't sit down. And it was a lot of fun for everybody. And they had a PA announcer named Tex Rickard, same name as the old boxing promoter. And Tex, on the hottest day in Brooklyn, he had this heavy white sweater with Brooklyn Dodgers in blue letters across it, the Brooklyn script. And every time a guy hit a home run, Tex would run out at home plate and shake his hand. And you'd see the back page of the Daily News or the Mirror. They'd have Hodges crossing the plate, and Tex Rickard is in every picture. And we had a deal at Ebbets Field. When a guy hit a home run, he got a carton of Old Goals. He'd hit a home run, and one of the announcers would put the carton of Old Goals on the screen back of the plate and roll it down. Tex Rickard would grab it, take it, and give it to the hitter. Another old goldie. That was pretty minor league, but it went over in Brooklyn.
It worked.
Yeah.
Or as they would say in Brooklyn, it worked.
Yeah, it worked.
One target that the Symphony really loved was during the World Series when Casey Stengel would head the mound to talk to a pitcher.
Oh, yeah, they loved Casey because he was such a character, Casey should have been an actor, really. He should have been on Broadway. He was just a natural, and I guess whatever he did, the symphony would love it.
You finished in Brooklyn. You go, as did Leo, across the river to the Polo Grounds. Why?
I went to the Giants because, number one, they were going to pay me more money. And number two, instead of working with 2 other guys in the booth, I worked with only one. And the Giants had come to me the year before, even in 1948, after my first time with Brooklyn. They wanted me to come, and I felt like I hadn't been there long enough. I didn't want to move. And this time I decided I'd go to the Polo Grounds and work for the New York Giants.
Well, Ernie, Hilda Chester was crushed when Leo DeRocher left the Bums for the hated Giants. And then at the end of the season, she gets slammed again because Ernie crosses over to the Polo Grounds. Now, which hurt her the most, Ernie? You leaving or DeRocher?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. It was Leo the Lip that caused all the hurt. I don't think Hilda cared one way or the other whether I left or not. But anyway, I did leave, and I went to the Giants.
1951 was a magical year for the Giants. First of all, you've got a young outfielder who has a pretty decent reputation coming in as a rookie, a 19-year-old named Willie Mays.
There's a long drive way back in center field, way back. It is gone. Second, Doby is able to go to third. Willie Mays just brought this crowd to its feet with a catch, which must have been an optical illusion to a lot of people. Where that 483-foot mark is in center field. The ball itself, Russ, you know this ballpark better than anyone else I know, had to go about 460, didn't it? It certainly did, and I don't see how Willie did it, but he's been doing it all year.
What'd you think when you first saw him?
I thought, about like everybody else did, that here's a guy that's a great prospect. I hadn't seen him until he reported for duty on May the 25th, 1951, and they brought him up from Minneapolis, which was in the American Association. Willie was batting .477 at the time, and they brought him down. They went through New York, and they brought him down to Shibe Park in Philadelphia where the Giants were playing. And the first time I saw him was in batting practice. He hit half a dozen balls or maybe a dozen in the seats. And everybody that saw him was pretty wild-eyed, and we figured here's a guy that's going to be an okay prospect. But he had a little trouble at first. He went 1 for the first 26 times at bat. And Willie was very discouraged. Got back to the Polo Grounds. He'd hit that one hit was a home run off Warren Spahn in New York, but he still felt down on himself. And he went into the manager's office and talked to Leo DeRocher, and Willie was crying. He said, "Leo, you got to send me back." I just can't play here in the big leagues. I'm not that good. And DeRocher said, now look, Willie, as long as I've got New York across my uniform, you're going to be my center fielder. So just go out there and play your game and relax, and you'll be okay. So that's what he did. And, of course, he had a rather slow start, but he picked it up and became the Rookie of the Year and did some pretty good contributing to the Giants' drive to the pennant, and then later on became one of the great players of all time.
Now, that talk by Leo was not quite the same kind of talk that you had with Leo on the train sometime before that, was it?
What happened was we were coming back from Chicago on the Pullman, and we'd gotten up and had breakfast coming into New York, and I was in my partner Russ Hodges' compartment reading the paper, and Leo came in, saw the blustery, and he went over to where I was reading the paper, and he slapped the paper right back in my face. And normally I'm pretty mild and can take almost anything, and in the case of Leo, though, I knew that he always had to have a stooge. And once you got in his stooge casting, you were in trouble. So I grabbed him and we began to wrestle and huff and puff. And finally, I think inertia set in and we both had to quit. And we were good friends. I enjoyed being with Leo, played a lot of golf with him, went to parties with him. He was an amazing personality and a very good friend of mine. But it was sort of a little funny incident that I had a fight with Leo DeRocher.
All right, the 51 Giants, even with Willie Mays working himself into the lineup and becoming more comfortable, and guys like Whitey Lockman and Don Mueller, they fell behind, and I believe as late as August the 12th, they were 13.5 games out of first place. What happened in that last 2 weeks?
In the last part of the season, after being back 13.5, the Giants just began to win. They were very relaxed. I don't think they felt that they were in the pennant race. I don't think they felt they had a chance. I know on the last Western trip, everybody was loose. We were playing golf most of the time. If we had a few spare hours, we'd go out and go to the golf course. The New York papers, as I remember, I don't think they even sent beat reporters on the trip with us. They were just covered by AP, and you might have a column written once in a while. But they began to win. They began to build confidence in themselves. But they still didn't feel that they were in the pennant race until just about the last week of the race in 1951, when they were then 3 or 4 games back. And all of a sudden, the Dodgers began to lose, and the Giants caught them. They finally tied them after the Dodgers lost to Philadelphia in Philadelphia on Friday night. The pennant race was tied. And then each team won on Saturday and each team won on Sunday. The Dodgers finished on Sunday after the Giants did. The Giants had beaten the Boston Braves, and I remember we were in the clubhouse listening to the game on the radio from Philadelphia, and the Phillies had a pretty good lead. We thought it was about over, that the Phillies were going to beat the Dodgers and the Giants would win the pennant. But after we got on the train, we got down to about Providence, and Chub Feeney, the vice president of the Giants, got off and went into the station there and found out that the Dodgers had rallied and beaten the Phillies. And he came back on the train and said, well, all right, guys, you got to report to Ebbets Field tomorrow. We're going to have a 3-game playoff.
Now, the Dodgers didn't feel like the Giants really made an honest comeback to cut that 13.5 game lead down to a tie. Wasn't there some accusations of sign stealing that helped them, maybe somebody in the scoreboard?
Well, there was a mention of sign stealing, but I really think that came out a good bit later on. At the time the games were being played, I don't think that was a factor. There'd always been a talk about sign stealing at the Polo Grounds and also at Old Comiskey Park and some of the other parks around the major leagues, and I think some of it was partially true. But I don't think it was a factor at that time. It was later on when a Wall Street Journal reporter came up with ex post facto news that there had been sign stealing in that series.
All right, the Dodger-Giant rivalry, was it a feud? Was it just the fact that everybody was so enamored with their team and so wrapped up in what their team was doing that they just didn't want anybody else to beat them, and the Giants just happened to be the closest?
No, I think it was a feud. I think there was an absolute hatred between those two organizations because they competed for attention and for money in the same area, for one thing. There'd always been animosity between those two teams. I know it went way back into the 30s and maybe even farther back than that. But there was a lot of hatred between the players, and it didn't matter what year it was or what the personnel was on each team. there was always that feuding atmosphere between the two clubs.
Okay, the Dodgers get that coin toss. They take Game 1 at Ebbets, but they lose Game 1. Had the strategy by Dressen backfired because he wanted to get a one-game lead and then hope to win one out of the two and take the three-game series?
Well, I think it backfired because then you went back to the Polo Grounds, and the Giants were then with the home field advantage for the next two games. They had to split those two games if they were going to win it. But Labine was very effective for the Dodgers in the second game, and he blanked the Giants 10-0, and that set up the third and final game. So on October the 3rd, the next day, everything was going to ride on that one game. The whole pennant race and the championship and the right to play the Yankees in the 1951 World Series.
It was all coming down to one game. There were 5 radio networks on hand to broadcast the game and 1 television network, and that was you to do it. But only parts of 3 of those broadcasts were preserved that we still have today. And one of those was the Liberty Network and Gordon McClendon, who sets up the beginning of this great third game.
Under dark, gloomy, somber skies at the Polo Grounds in New York, it's the greatest show on earth. The Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants' final sudden death showdown payoff game, the playoff payoff. After 156 games, each 2 more than the regular schedule calls for, the Bums from Brooklyn, the Giants from New York have come down to the wire to where it is all or nothing. What happened before, even the Giants' closing rush from 13 and a half out, will be forgotten when the final decision is rendered at the Polo Grounds this afternoon. 20 years from now, the fans will be talking about this afternoon's hero as yet unknown, but the man and the hour are about to meet. If there is a GOAT, his name will echo down the corridor of time, coupled with Fred Merkle, a bonehead fame.
Well, Ernie, everybody remembers Bobby Thompson hitting the home run, but what a lot of people don't remember about that game was he possibly could have been a GOAT.
He was well on his way to being the GOAT of that big game. He had misplayed a couple of ground balls at third base, and as a base runner, he'd gotten a base hit, and then running to second base, he ran up the back of his teammate Whitey Lockman, and the Giants ended up with 2 guys at second base, and eventually Bobby Thompson was caught in a rundown and tagged out. So I say you're right, he was ready for the fitting of the goat horns.
All right, we're going into the 9th inning. Don Newcomb, who has just had a fantastic 3 games because he has pitched something like 33 innings in 4 days and takes a 4-1 lead into the 9th inning, and everybody thinks the game's over.
Well, I was one of those guys who thought the game was over, Bob. It looked like the way Newcomb was throwing that the Giants couldn't touch him, and I believe most all Giant fans were ready to say, let's get ready to go home.
I'm telling you what they're going to say about this one, I don't know. Bobby Thompson, the batter. The outfield deep and very much to the left. Ralph Branca on the hill in favor of Newcomb. Rube Walker catching the pitch to Bobby. A strike call off the knees. Quick curve. The Branca ripped right in. Branca has that tremendous overarm sinker curve that drops down. Then he has a roundhouse hook curve to right-hand batter. Here's Bobby waiting. Branca throws. Bobby swings. Nice long right there on the left. Going. The Giants win the pennant. I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. It's the greatest victory in all baseball history. The greatest come from behind triumph in the history of the game as Bobby Thompson hit a 2-on base home run in the last half of the 9th inning, and the new National League champions are the New York Giants.
Well, Ernie, after you tied up your duties with TV, you hustled down to the locker room where you had a chance to interview some of the players from both the Giants and the Dodgers.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, my partner just got here, Ernie Harwell. So, Ernie, grab a microphone, and I'll try to round you up some guys.
All right, fine, Ross. It's wonderful, folks. We're in a madhouse here, and all the ball players now on the Giants are being taken out on the steps, where there's a tremendous crowd out there that's giving them every cheer that their Royal winners deserve. They certainly came from behind and did a tremendous job today, a job that has never been duplicated in baseball history. And the clubhouse is not a clubhouse, but a madhouse. Everybody moving around and yapping and talking and jabbering, and newspaper men and photographers and newsreel men. Everybody in the sports world here, and all amazed by this tremendous last-minute finish by the New York Giants. There's been nothing like it in baseball history. Bobby Thompson, the hero, with his big home run that won the Giant game, is out on the front steps.
Well, here's Ernie Harwell with one of the great guys from the game today, Duke Snyder. Hi, Duke.
That's right, Russ. Duke Snyder here. He's come over to congratulate the Giant players on their victory. Duke, you played on a great ball club this year, and you made a great drive for the pennant, and it was just too bad. Looked like the Giants had it there in that last inning.
Yes, Ernie, I feel very bad about it. I wish all the Giants good luck in beating the Yankees, but I'll still, my heart's in Brooklyn. I can't.
Well, naturally, we expected to beat Duke, and best of luck to you and the Dodgers next year.
Thank you.
Thanks for dropping in. It's very nice of you to come over and to say hello to these Giants and congratulate them on their victory in 1951. We just heard from Duke Snyder, the fine Brooklyn outfielder, as he came over to talk to the Giants and congratulate them. Many of the Dodgers have come in. Jackie Robinson was here, Snyder, and many others.
Here's Roy Campanella with Ernie Harwell.
Hi, Ernie. How's
Well,
everything?
Roy,
Wasn't that a tough one?
it was a tough ball
Never
game for the
seen
Dodgers.
nothing like it. Well, I wish you the best of luck anyhow.
Well, thanks a lot, Roy.
Somebody has to win.
Too
somebody
bad,
gotta
Roy,
lose.
you couldn't have been in there swinging that big club.
Well,
I know how you feel about
it's
that.
one of those things I wanted to play, but I couldn't run, so I couldn't help them any.
Well, good luck to you in that new Emporium of yours at 134th
Well,
Street.
I still want the Giants to win the series anyhow.
I know how you feel.
Thank you, Roy. Thanks for dropping in. And Russ Hodges is coming over with one of the winning players of 1951, Willie Mays. Well, Willie, what's your reaction to all this excitement?
Well, I tell you, I'm one of the happy boys in my life because I'm a young boy, true enough, but it's one of the happy moments of my life to be here playing with the Giants for this season. And next year, I hope we win the same thing. But in the World Series, I think the Yankees will have a hard team to beat because we have great pitching.
And you've got a great ball club all around and a tremendous spirit, Willie.
That's what I think so, too.
Well, it's nice to have you here, and best of luck to you in the World Series.
Thank you.
You've done a great job for the Giants this year. And just give those Yankees a business, will you?
We'll do that.
All right. Thank you, Willie.
Now, this is Russ Hodges.
And Ernie Harwell.
Saying so long. The Giants won the pennant, and we'll be seeing you at the World Series. Goodbye.
There's probably never been a post-game interview that really showed the range of emotions that amplify losing and winning than the comments of Bobby Thompson and Ralph Branca, two men who were tied together for life.
Bobby, you drove in your 98th, 99th. Oh, how do you feel?
The third one I drove in.
Bobby Thompson, did you fall down coming around third?
I fell down. I didn't touch the ground once.
You just flew on, Bob. Oh, that's wonderful.
Oh, the bad high.
That is
fastball.
Oh, you said a bad high impact.
Oh, I don't know. Good living, I don't know what it is.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
Let me alone. Go ahead, let me alone. Let me be, will you? You saw what happened. Things are tough enough. Yeah, I knew it was gone all the way. All I kept saying was sink, sink, sink. I knew he hit the ball, he uppercutted, he hit the ball with overspin. It was like a curveball. It was sinking down. All I remember is seeing Pap go up against the wall, and then I was walking to the clubhouse. All I kept saying was, why me, why me? Why do they have to...
You had the privilege of watching one of the more exciting players of that era in Mays. What areas did he improve his game, his abilities, and such?
He was a natural, and I think as he matured, he got better in all departments, but I couldn't say that he improved one any more than another. If you'd pick one, it would probably be in power hitting because he grew a little bit, got stronger, and got a little experience and knew what pitchers were pitching to him. But he was so great, he could do everything, and he made the greatest catch I've ever seen in a regular season game. You know, we talk about the World Series in 1954, but Willie made a great catch in Pittsburgh in the 1951, his rookie season.
Mm-hmm.
And they were playing the Pirates, and Rocky Nelson was at bat. It was a situation where Willie was in center field. Rocky had a line drive to left center. Willie races over, catches the ball with his bare hand in the air, a vicious line drive, and he's coming in now, and he knows that his teammates are going to give him all the accolades and slap him on the back and tell him how great he is. But what he doesn't know as a rookie is that these old-timers are going to go silent and not react at all, and then they're going to say, let's see what the kid's going to do when we do this. So he comes in and he looks over at the dugout, and they are stone cold. They're sitting there like statues, not saying a word, and Willie can't comprehend it. So he finally goes down to the end of the dugout and looks in and says to his manager, Leo DeRocha, and he's got a real high voice, Willie. He says, Leo, I just made a great catch. And DeRocha strokes his chin and looks up and says, Willie, I didn't see it. Go out and do it again next inning. Oh, he did it a lot of times, believe me.
You made a lot of great catches. Of course, the one that was publicized the most was that World Series catch in '54. But I remember one in Pittsburgh that you caught a line drive barehanded off the bat, I think, of Rocky Nelson. As you couldn't get to the ball, you're running toward the left field. You remember that?
That's correct. Rocky Nelson was really a poor hitter at that time, and I was shading him around to right, and he hit a line drive to left center that I was running, and seemed like the ball just started rising. As it was started rising, I don't know why, I just stuck out my hand and just caught the ball in midair. Now, the only thing that I didn't like about it, when I got back to the dugout, nobody said a word to me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nobody said nothing. And I said to myself, my God, I just made the best play of my life.
Yeah.
And then Leo started laughing, and that was, to me, that was the best part of the whole catch.
Yeah.
Catching the ball, going to the dugout, nobody saying nothing to me, and then all of a sudden everybody broke out. And that's the type of fun we had.
Who was the best center fielder of them all in New York?
That was a great topic of conversation around the water cooler. Of course, the Giant fans thought Willie Mays was the greatest. The Yankee fans' vote went to Mickey Mantle, and the Dodger fans thought that nobody was any better than Duke Snider. And they were all three great outfielders, and no question about that. And my choice was Willie Mays. But I was with the Giants. I was prejudiced in that direction. And I think probably I would vote for Mantle, except that he was hurt so much. And the wisdom, I think, generally in baseball was if Mickey Mantle had stayed healthy, he would have been probably the greatest player of all time because he ran with amazing speed. He was a great fielder. He could do everything in the field, and he hit with power from each side of the plate, and you can't do any better than that.
Willie had a couple of trademarks. Number one was the basket catch, catching the ball, a fly ball at the waist. Another one was the hat, always flying off when he took off after a ball. I've heard the rumor that he always wore a hat that was one size too small, so it would come off very quickly when he took off. Is that
well, that's
true?
what everybody said, Bob. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I guess that's showmanship. But he was a great player. And the thing about Willie Mays, not only did he have great natural ability, he played with a verve and a spirit that very few other players could ever match. And you got the idea as you sat in the stands and watched Willie Mays perform that here's a kid that loved to play baseball. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do and doing it in the very best way possible. And say hey, you know, they called him because he was always saying say hey.
Say hey, say who, say Willie, say hey, say who, swinging at the plate, say hey, say who, say Willie, that Giants kid is great. Yes, he covers center like he had jet shoes. The other batters get the Willie blues. Anything hit his way is out. Man, it just don't pay those guys to clout. Say hey, say who, say Willie, say hey, say who, swinging at the plate, say hey, say who, say Willie, that Giants kid is great.
Well, at the end of the 53 season, you had to move on to your third major league team, leaving New York for Baltimore.
The situation there was the Giants didn't renew my contract, and I got an offer right away from Baltimore to come down there and be the voice of the Orioles. And that was a great break for me because Baltimore had not had baseball in the modern era in the big leagues. And I was going to be the voice of the Birds. And I think it's always a big advantage for an announcer to come in and be the first guy on the scene. So I was lucky, and Baltimore was a great place to work. The Orioles were a good organization. They had a very bad team. The hitting was terrible. The leading home run hitter, Vern Stevens, had 8 home runs that year.
Wow.
So that tells you what kind of power they had.
Well, you also had a big sponsor who was sponsoring the games there in Baltimore for you. And early in your time in Baltimore, the PR folks wanted you to take some of the executives out and kind of smooze them a little bit. And
Oh, yeah.
you ended up in a place that I don't know whether you really wanted to be that night or not.
I was working for National Bow. That was the beer that had bought the Oriole rights, and we had a sales manager named Norman Albany, and I'd only been in Baltimore about a week, I guess. I was living at the hotel. My family was still in New York. They hadn't joined me. And Mr. Albany called me and said, Ernie, I think it'd be a good idea. We're going to have a lot of clients and salespeople, and we're going down to the Oasis, and we'd like for you to join us down there. Well, the Oasis was on what they call the Baltimore Block. So the Baltimore Block had a reputation of being a pretty bad place to frequent. But I went down there anyway to the Oasis, and they were having their big party, and they had these dancers, and they had an MC named Sid Gray. And the Oasis was really sort of an upholstered sewer. That was about all it was. And they serve you drinks, had 90% water in them and charge you $10, that kind of a place. And Sid Gray is a pasty-faced MC. And he's introducing these dancers as beautiful debutantes from Towson, Maryland. And the guys are having a pretty good time. And Sid gets in his brain that he should introduce me. Now, I've only been there about a week, and nobody really knows who I am at all. But he gives me this flower introduction about, here's the greatest broadcaster of all time, the guy we all listen to, and everybody loves him here in Baltimore, as if they knew who I was. And he said, it's Ernie Harwell. Stand up, Ernie, stand up. And I stand up, and, they got a little applause there. And I sit down, and he says, Ernie, stand up again. And I stand up again. He said, sit down, you little so-and-so. Nobody wants to see you around here. So I figure the second time around, sometimes not too good.
In addition to doing the Orioles broadcast, you also had a shot at the Baltimore Colts.
The situation there was when I went to Baltimore, the National Bowl had the Orioles, and the Gunther Beer had the Colts. So if you did football, you couldn't do baseball, and vice versa. But there was one year when the same beer that I worked for had both the Colts and the Orioles, and that was a year that I was able to do the Colt games. And it was right before they ascended into the championship era that they had with Johnny Unitas. I remember the first game that I did on the radio for the Colts at Memorial Stadium. Alan Amici took the ball from scrimmage on the very first to play from scrimmage and went 78 yards for a touchdown. So it was a pretty good season. They had a pretty fair team, and Weeb Eubank was a coach, and I became very friendly with Weeb and Lucy Eubank. They were great people, and we used to visit with them, and they'd come over to our house a lot. And I enjoyed that one season I did the Colt games.
Dupre going out on a short pass to the right, moves up to the 29-yard line, and the Colts have a first down. Their first down of the second half. They trail 10-0 behind the Los Angeles Rams here at the Coliseum before a rain-soaked crowd. Chicago Bears beat the Lions earlier in the afternoon, and the Colts are now a full game back of both of these ball clubs. Buddy Young flanks wide to the left. Shaw up under center. He's got Amici and Dupre behind him. The blue-shirted Colts are ready to go. Long count. Here's a handoff. It goes to Dupre. He tries to slant off the left tackle and drives to the 31-yard line. McFadden made the stop. The left tackle on defense of the Los Angeles Rams after Dupre picked up 2 yards. It'll be second down and 8 to go. The ball on the 31-yard line.
Now, you mentioned your house there in Baltimore. Rather unusual house. Very large, very stately. You did quite a bit of entertaining there, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, we had a great time. It was an old house, not more than 10 minutes from the ballpark. And it had been a farmhouse, actually, but it had about 9 rooms and 8 bathrooms. And it was built in 1856, had a porch all the way around. We loved it. We kept a horse, and the kids rode the horse. And Milton Eisenhower, the president's brother, lived next door to us, and he'd come over and visit with us from time to time. And we had a good time. And then when the ball clubs would come in, we'd have crab feast. I remember when the Tiger team came in, a lot of the Tigers came out. And my nephew, Ree Harwell, was visiting at the time, and he bit Mel Ott, who was in the broadcasting the Tigers game with Van Patrick.
Now, let's move back one step. Your nephew was teething. He was only, a year,
year and a half
old?
Oh, yeah, just wonder what the teething is, yeah. But yeah, he wasn't an adult. He wasn't a Dracula.
Absolutely. You mentioned your horse. There was an amazing incident one night when you were on the road, I believe, and the Star of Arabia, which was your horse's name, decided to see more of the neighborhood than just your backyard.
Yeah, you're right, Bob. She got out, ran all around town, crossed Charles Street, dodged the traffic, went over on Loyola University on the campus there, tore it up with her hoofs, and early in the morning, Lula didn't even know the horse was gone. She'd put the twins to bed, and the boys were in the bed. Lula's awakened by the police cars coming up our driveway. And they ring the doorbell, and she goes down there in a hurry, and the policeman says, "I'm sorry, lady, that this horse is coming up into your yard. We've been chasing him." And she said, "Well, that's okay, it's my horse." But in the meantime, she had locked herself out of the house in the hurry to get out, and they had to break the window to get back in and let her back in to take care of the twins.
Baltimore also was the place where you got to know a gentleman that remained friends for quite a number of years, George Kell.
Absolutely. George came there in the last part of his career. Paul Richards brought him in from Chicago. He played third base, and George and I became good friends. He would visit my house. He and his wife Charlene and the kids would come out. We'd play golf together. And in his final year, George was hit in the head, had a couple of other injuries, and he was slowing down and about ready to quit. Well, they put him on the disabled list when he got hit in the head, and he didn't have anything else to do. So when he was at the ballpark, he came up to the press box. And while he was up there, I said, "Hey, George, why don't you come on and do an inning with us?" And he came on the Oriole broadcast with Herb Carneal and me, and he did a great job. He was well accepted, the little bit he did, and I think it sort of put a bug in his ear about being an announcer. And later on, after he quit that year, he did get a job in sports broadcasting. CBS came to him and asked him to work on the pregame show on the TV, the game of the week. And it was a pretty good spot for George, and he called me from his home in Arkansas. He said, "I'm going to do the first interview on my show with Casey Stengel." And he said, "Have you got any ideas about what to ask him?" And I said, "Well, just be yourself. You'll be great. But if you need a question, I think you could ask Casey, how does he select his batting order? In other words, why does he pick a certain guy to hit first or second or third and so forth?" And he said, "Well, that might work." So after the season started and they'd done a show or two, I saw George and I said, "How'd the interview with Stengel go?" He said it was fine, but we didn't get past the leadoff man.
It took the entire show to talk about the leadoff man. That was Casey. Now, you had the opportunity of broadcasting games for Jackie Robinson with the Dodgers. And then in Baltimore, your association began with another pretty fair country ball player whose last name was Robinson as well. You were there when Brooks broke in.
Oh, yeah, he was a great kid. I love Brooks Robinson. He's one of my favorite players, one of my favorite people. He had come out of Arkansas, and at that time was 17, 18 years old. He had a brief time with the Birds. They brought him up, and the first game he played, they played in Washington against the Senators. He got 2 for 4. He had a couple of hits, didn't seem to have any trouble. He went back to the hotel, called his dad, and said, "It's not as tough as I thought it was going to be up here." And then I think he didn't get a hit the rest of the season. He learned his lesson early. And he went back to a couple of places, and finally Vancouver, and they brought him up from Vancouver. And then he came up to stay. But he was a magician with a glove, and he was a pretty good hitter and got better as his career lengthened. The first time I saw Brooks, I was with the Orioles when they came into Detroit. They had brought Brooks up. He had not yet signed at that point, and they put him out at second base and let him work out. He was a skinny guy. Looked like he weighed about 150 pounds at that time, and a good strong wind could blow him over. But eventually they signed him, and he went on to be a true Hall of Famer.
One of the best fielders the game has ever seen, and you've seen a lot of great guys with the glove, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Rex Barney, my old pal from the Dodgers, who did the PA at Baltimore for years and was very popular, he always maintained that Billy Cox at Brooklyn was a better third baseman than Brooks. He loved Brooks, but he thought that Billy was better. So that was a guy. And a lot of the National Leaguers, I guess, leaned to Mike Schmidt. And, of course, the old-timers like the Pie Traynor, and even before that, maybe Jimmy Collins, way back in the early 1900s. But there are not too many third basemen in the Hall of Fame when you compare them against other positions.
Cuellar, since July 1st, has won 16 out of 19 games. That's a... Oh! Robinson does it again! Brooks Robinson making another phenomenal play at third. Here it is. You watch it. We're getting used to seeing this. Diving, taking in foul territory. It's been a baseball ballet at third base in the 73rd. A long drive foul by Lee May. And Robinson has already been named the winner of the 16th Annual Sport Magazine World Series Award as the outstanding player in the 70 Series. No question about it.
Let's stop in 1958 for just a minute. Young man from Huntersville, North Carolina, who threw one of the hardest pitches in the world to hit, the knuckleball, pitched a no-hitter one afternoon. Hoyt Wilhelm.
Yeah, Hoyt Wilhelm was a guy that Paul Richard had a lot of faith in. Paul got him fairly late in his career. He was a starter and a reliever. His real fame came from the bullpen, but at this point, in 1958, Wilhelm was a starting pitcher for the Orioles. He pitched against the Yankees and pitched the first no-hitter that anybody had ever pitched against the New York Yankees, and also the first no-hitter in the Baltimore Oriole big league history. So it was a big occasion for Herb Carneal and for me as we broadcast that no-hitter at Memorial Stadium that Wilhelm achieved.
2 down in the 9th inning, 1-0, the Birds in the lead. The windup, the pitch is outside for a ball, 1-1. Well, this crowd going wild now and rooting for Hoyt Wilhelm all the way. Here's the windup and the pitch. He swings and misses, 2 strikes. Well, he needs only one more pitch, if it can be the right one. 1-2, the count on Bauer. 2 down in the 9th inning. Wilhelm kicking around a little bit out on the mound. Now check at his side. Bauer guarding the plate. Here it comes. He swings, and there's a high pop-up into right field. It may be. Gardner going back. Tasby in. Gardner's got it. A no-hitter for Wilhelm. He's got a no-hitter. Wilhelm pitches the first no-hitter in modern Oriole history, and he's mobbed by his teammates as he comes to the dugout. It's a brilliant no-hit victory for Hoyt Wilhelm. Bauer, the last man, hit a fly ball into short right field, picked off by Billy Gardner. And Hoyt Wilhelm has made Baltimore history here today at Memorial Stadium with a brilliant no-hit shutout over the American League champion New York Yankees.
Prior to the 60 season, you got another phone call, and this one's from your old friend George Kell, and this one takes you to Tiger Town.
What happened was the Orioles were finishing the season in New York, and we'd had a game at Yankee Stadium on Saturday. It was a night game, and I got back to the Hotel Roosevelt, and it was fairly late, and the phone rang. It was George Kell, and he said, Ernie, Van Patrick is out. He's not going to be the announcer anymore here with the Tigers. I've worked with him this year, 1959. The Tigers asked me to call you and find out if you're interested in leaving Baltimore and coming to Detroit to be the announcer. And I said, well, George, I love Baltimore. I'm having a good time there. Things are going good, but I'd be foolish not to listen to some kind of an offer. Tell them that I'm interested, and we'll see what happens. So I went to my sponsors, Gunther, and told them that I'd had this conversation, and they wanted me to come out and talk to them in Detroit. And they said, well, go ahead and just give us the courtesy of coming back and telling us about the offer and see if we want to meet it or not. I went out and I talked to Mr. Harry Sisson during the World Series of '59, and he took me over to meet John Stroh. The Stroh Brewery was buying the rights to the Tigers beginning the next year, and I met Mr. Stroh at the brewery, and they made me an offer. It was pretty good, and I was attracted to it. I went back and talked to Gunther, and they said, well, that's more than we can manage, so good luck, and we enjoyed having you here, and so forth. So I left and went to Detroit, and it's probably the best move that I ever made because I stayed there a while, and I really appreciated the great love and affection that the people of Michigan have shown me over the years.
Again, sponsorships played a big part in a job change.
Oh, it did. Van Patrick had been working for a brewery called Goebel, and they switched to Stroh, and Stroh wasn't too anxious to have Van continue as the announcer because he had identification with the brewing rivals, so I think that at least partially led to his dismissal.
Now, George Kell had replaced Mel Ott.
Right. Mel Ott had been killed in an automobile accident in '58, and he and his wife were hit by a car down in Louisiana. Mrs. Ott survived, but Mel died, and George replaced Mel, so he'd had a year under his belt when I came there.
The last day of spring training, there was a blockbuster trade between the Tigers and the Cleveland Indians. What precipitated that trade?
Well, that was one of the great trades of all time, because generally when two clubs trade, they usually trade a couple of Humpty Dumptys, as Clint Courtney once said, guys that don't help either team. But this was Harvey Keene of the Tigers going to Cleveland in exchange for Rocky Colavito. Harvey Keene was the American League batting champion. Colavito was a home run champion. So you had two stars being traded for each other. And I can remember Rick Farrell, who was vice president, general manager of the Tigers, came to the press box the final day of spring training. We were finishing up our broadcast, and he came into the press box and said, "We've got a deal," and he told us what the deal was. And sure enough, the Tigers and the Indians opened the season in Cleveland, 1960, and these two guys who had been traded for each other played against each other in that first game.
Had it ever happened before, or has it happened since, when the batting champion and the home run champion were swapped for each other?
Not that I know of. It might have, but I can't recall it, Bob. It's entirely possible, but it was a unique situation at that time.
What were your first thoughts when you walked into Tiger Stadium?
My first time in Tiger Stadium actually was with the Orioles. I had gone there in 1954. Baltimore opened their modern big league history with a game at what was in Briggs Stadium in 1954, and Steve Gromack shut out Baltimore, beat them 3-0. Boone hit a home run. I remember that were 2 or 3 home runs off the Tiger bats, and that was my first look at Tiger Stadium. Then the Orioles beat him in the second game and went back to open in Baltimore. But when I went in as a Tiger announcer, it was something special, because now this was going to be my home. I was going to be in this little booth as much as I was going to be in my living room during the summer, and I was going to be part of the Tiger franchise. So it was a great moment for me when I went back there in 1960 and became the Tiger announcer.
The Keene for Colavito trade was not the only trade that got headlines that season for the Tigers and the Cleveland Indians, was it?
No, and they had another very interesting situation, another unique trade. I don't think this has ever happened before or after. 2 managers were traded for each other. Jimmy Dykes was the manager at Detroit, and Joe Gordon was the manager at Cleveland. And Bill DeWitt was the president of the Tigers, and Frank Lane was the big boss in Cleveland. And they got together and decided that they couldn't switch a lot of players, so they would trade managers. And Gordon came to Detroit, and Jimmy Dykes went to Cleveland. And I don't think either one of the managers liked that very much. They thought it sort of denigrated their position being traded. And Gordon quit after a year with the Tigers. He announced his retirement on the trip back from Kansas City after the final game. Jimmy went ahead because Jimmy always showed up somewhere, you know. He was a great little pixie who loved cigars and stories, and a terrific guy, and he stayed in baseball for quite a while.
1961, Ernie, saw quite a few large events in baseball. The one that's gotten the most publicity, of course, was the Mantle-Maris chase for the home run record, and then, of course, Roger eventually breaking Babe Ruth's single-season record. We've seen 61. We've seen the documentaries that have been done about that year in his life. What did you observe in that chase that summer?
I saw Mantle and Maris battling each other for the whole season, and the pressure really got to Roger. I really liked Roger Maris. I thought he was a terrific guy. He was an underrated player. He was a fine defensive outfielder, had a great arm, and certainly everybody knows he could hit. But he was under a great deal of pressure, and I don't think he could handle the relationship with the media. He couldn't understand why these guys in every town would ask him the same question. You know, he'd go to Detroit, and they'd ask him, how you doing, how you going to break the record, are you going to beat Mantle, and so forth. And then he'd go to Chicago, he'd get the same set of questions. And he just couldn't comprehend why that would be happening. And he began to be very standoffish with the media. His teammates loved him. They really did. They thought he was a great guy and a great team guy. But I noticed that he was nervous, not at ease at all. His hair began to fall out, and he just had a miserable time. And he should have been enjoying the year because he was going to be a footnote to history or maybe a headline to history. But he couldn't take the media attention, and I think that was his big problem.
And added to that, even the Yankee fans wanted to see Mickey break the record and not Roger.
Yeah, that's ironic, too, because at one time the Yankee fans weren't that fond of Mantle in the early going, and when he began to challenge Babe Ruth's record, they didn't like that. But now they turned because Mantle had become a hero, and Maris was sort of a villain in a sense. And you're right about that. That's a good observation that I hadn't thought about. But that was the way the Yankee fans turned on Roger, and he wasn't as big a hero, certainly, as Mickey Mantle was to them.
Here comes Roger Maris. They're standing up, waiting to see if Maris is going to hit number 61. Here's the windup. The pitch to Roger, way outside, ball one. And the fans are starting to boo. Low ball two. That one was in the dirt. And the boos get louder. 2 balls, no strikes on Roger Maris. Here's the windup. Fastball hit deep to right. This could be it. Way back there. Holy cow, he's in it. 61 for Maris. Look at him fight for that ball out there. Holy cow, what a shot. Another standing ovation for Roger Maris. 61 home runs, and they're still fighting for that ball out there. People are climbing over each other's backs. One of the greatest sights I've ever seen here at Yankee Stadium.
While baseball has been the majority of your professional career, 1963 saw you step into another press box, and that at East Lansing. Talk a little bit about your switch over to Michigan State football.
Yeah, I did Michigan State one year, 1963. Jim Gross in Lansing wanted me to be on a network that he set up and do the Michigan State games, and I really enjoyed it. I went to Mr. Fetzer, who owned the Tigers, and asked if I could have permission. He said, well, you can do football if you don't miss any baseball games. So that was sort of hard to do. I missed the first game. My partner, Mark Allman, did that, and then from then on I was able to do the games in the 63 season. And I got lucky on the second game that they played. They played in Los Angeles in the Coliseum, and I was doing the World Series between the Yankees and the Dodgers and happened to be in L.A. at the same time, and it was an off day in the World Series, wherefore I could do the game for the Michigan State Spartans, and I enjoyed that season. But I found out, Bob, that I couldn't mix it with baseball because the 2 seasons began to overlap so much, and I just had to give it up. It was fun, and I know you've done football and enjoyed it, but your basketball and football run together sometimes too, don't they?
Exactly, and we have an overlap, and thank goodness I don't have to miss too many of them, but every now and then you have to make a decision.
Right.
Let's fast forward now to 1967, another very monumental year, not just for the Tigers, but for the city of Detroit, because as you have described, one night you're at the ballpark and you see smoke rising over the outfield fence. What goes through your mind when you see that?
Well, that was a terrible feeling when the riots started in Detroit. The city was divided. It was a very unsafe atmosphere. Rumors were rampant about what was going to happen. Nobody felt safe. There was all sort of anxiety and worry among the people of Detroit. And the National Guard was finally called out, and they quelled the riots. But a lot of people were killed, property was destroyed, and it was a great blot on the city. And it was a terrible, terrible time. The Tigers tried to play through it. They did play that season and almost won the pennant in 67. With a little better break on the last couple of days, they could have been the champions, but they lost out. And when they went to spring training the next year, I think the fact that they had come so close weighed on their minds, and they said, if we can come this close, maybe we can win it in 68.
In 1968, Detroit came back very determined. They did not fall short this time. They won their first World Series since 1945. But what was the big difference in the 68 team versus 67?
Not too much difference in those two teams, Bob. It was a magical year for the Tigers, 1968. I think they were determined in spring training that since they'd come so close in 67, they could do it all and win it all in 68. And they had a combination of power hitting and great pitching, had terrific defense, had a good bench. The bullpen didn't make a whole lot of difference in those days, but they had a pretty fair bullpen. But they had Denny McClain and Mickey Lolich as the two great pitchers, and it was a team that had a different hero every day, and they stayed in first place practically the whole season.
3 men on, 2 men out. Game tied 1-1 in the ninth inning. McDaniel checking his time with Jake Gibbs. The tall right-hander ready to go to work again. And the windup and the pitch. He swings a line shot, base hit, right field. The Tigers win it. Here comes K-Line to score, and it's all over. Downward singles. The Tigers mob Don. K-Line has scored. The fans are streaming on the field, and the Tigers have won their first pennant since 1945. Let's listen to the bedlam here at Tiger Stadium.
'68 also sees a young pitcher go 31-6. What propelled Denny McClain to that kind of year?
Denny McClain got that kind of year because he was a great pitcher for that one season. He was a great pitcher a couple of seasons, but especially in 1968. He had great confidence in himself. He had a tremendously effective fastball. He had great control. The players loved to play behind him because he did work quickly. And he also seemed to have a good bit of luck, which you have to have when you're going to have a record like that. He just amazed the baseball nation with his accomplishment, and he breezed through that season, won 31 ball games, the only guy to do it since Dizzy Dean had done it back in the early 1930s, and it's a remarkable feat that's never happened since then.
Well, this is the big day for the maestro, Denny McClain. Saturday afternoon at Tiger Stadium, September the 14th, 1968, and Denny will be going for win number 30. Pitching rival of the Oakland Athletics, Chuck Dobson, and we've got a tremendous crowd here, and everybody looking forward to Denny's test, trying to get win number 30 of this season. The count on Horton is now 2 balls and 2 strikes. And Campaneris comes in from short, talks with his pitcher, Diego Segui. Here's the set by Segui, the pitch. Swung on, a drive to left. That'll be the ball game. It's over the head of Gosma. McClain wins his 30th. Here comes Stanley in to score. Willie Horton has a single, and the ball game is over, and the Tigers win it 5-4. Denny McClain is one of the first out of the dugout, racing out, and Horton is mobbed as the Tigers come from behind, and McClain has his 30th victory of the 1968 season.
But we go to the World Series. The Tigers make a move, moving a center fielder to shortstop, a rather unusual move, especially at the time it was done.
That was one of the great strategic moves in World Series history. Mayo Smith was the manager of the Tigers. Mickey Stanley was the center fielder. Mayo wanted to get Al Kaline, who had been injured part of the year, back into the lineup to play in the outfield. So he moved Stanley in to replace Ray Euler at shortstop. Euler, a great defensive player, but he hit about 130 or 135 and was one of the poorest hitters in baseball history. But Stanley was a great athlete, and he adjusted perfectly. He had a ground ball hit to him early in the first game of the World Series. He relaxed and played a great shortstop. But I can remember going to St. Louis with the Tigers when they opened the World Series in St. Louis. And the night before, I went around and I talked to, I'd say, 15 or 20 so-called experts about that move that was impending. And they all agreed that it was a bad move. Nobody told me that it was a good move. And I didn't think it was either, but it turned out to be a great move, and it worked.
Detroit gets down 3-1 to the St. Louis Cardinals. Game 5 sees the series in Detroit, and you had a hand in the opening of that World Series game with the national anthem.
Well, I sure did, and I almost got fired because of that, Bob. What had happened as the resident songwriter there at the ballpark, I was appointed by General Manager and President Jim Campbell to pick the anthem singers. And the Saturday game, I picked Margaret Whiting, who was a great ballad singer. She was a daughter of a great songwriter, a niece of another great songwriter, both the Whiting boys from Michigan. And she did a very standard rendition of the national anthem. And the second man I selected was Marvin Gaye from Motown. And it was a little ironic that Mr. Campbell came to me and said, now, we're a little concerned that Marvin might make it a little bit too bluesy and too much Motown. We'd like to have a straight rendition. Would you mind asking them to do it that way? So I did, and Marvin said, sure, I'll do it. So he sang it straight. And my third selection was a young man who had been born in Puerto Rico, grew up in the Bronx, New York, and was beginning to get fairly famous. He'd had a big hit on the charts, Come On, Light My Fire, and he was playing at Las Vegas. And a friend of mine who'd been in Hollywood in the record business said Jose Feliciano had done a great job of the national anthem at the Greek Theater in California, and he would be a great selection. So I went on the advice of this gentleman, and we got in touch with Feliciano. He said he'd be happy to come. He was playing in Vegas. He took the red eye to Detroit, got in the morning. Ollie McLaughlin, a record producer that was a good friend of mine, and I went out to meet him at the airport. We took him to the hotel. He freshened up, went to the ballpark, and went out to the clubhouses. The guys loved him there. They came out to the little ante room, and he made up a few songs about Al Kaline and Denny McLean and everybody else and sang them. And then he went out into the center field area with his leader dog and his dark glasses, all by himself, in front of the microphone with his guitar. He rendered the national anthem. And it was sort of a little bluesy anthem, and at that time, I think people thought it was a real departure from the regular anthems of Lucy Monroe and Kate Smith and people like that, and they were a little disturbed about it. But he sang it from the heart, and I thought he did a great job. All of a sudden, the headlines hit the paper about Feliciano and how he had crucified the national anthem. American Legion clubs rose up in anger. They said that they wanted a resolution passed that whoever sang the anthem had to do it straight ahead, completely on the notes and so forth, and that Feliciano was a communist and a traitor to the flag and everything like that. Well, I defended him because I had to. I picked the guy, and it was my responsibility. And the Tigers were pretty good about that. I got a little note from Jim Campbell and John Fetzer saying, watch out about your next selection if you ever get the chance to do one. But there were a lot of letters sent in, and they had a picture of Jose on the front page of the New York Times singing the national anthem, and it got to be quite a cause célèbre. But we became great friends, and later on I introduced Feliciano to the young lady that he eventually married and now is living in Connecticut with. They've raised a great family, and he is still singing and playing that great guitar.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleam, those broad spires
a Robert Merrill version. It wasn't, but it was tame compared to some of the modern-day renditions that we see.
Well, that's a great observation. I think now if you hear the renditions you get almost daily, you'd think that Feliciano's rendition was very tame compared to them.
Okay, back to the field now. Mickey Lolich, the story of the World Series in 1968.
Mickey was always overshadowed by Denny McLain. Denny had the 31-game victory season. Lolich had been a real good, strong-arm left-hander. He had worked as a starter. He'd been put in the bullpen from time to time. He got out there and did everything you could ask of him, and he was a magnificent pitcher. He was a good strikeout pitcher, and he had a good, strong left arm. He would do 350, 360 innings a season and do it beautifully. But in the regular season, he was overshadowed by Denny. But came the World Series. The Tigers lost the first game in St. Louis to Bob Gibson, and then Lolich pitched the second game, and they won that one big. Came back to Detroit, and it looked like the Tigers just weren't going anywhere. They played very bad baseball, and they were down to the Cardinals, and they came back and forced the seventh game of the World Series with Lolich against Bob Gibson. Two great pitchers, and I think the odds were certainly in favor of Gibson because he'd already won 2 games. And he was a magnificent pitcher, no question about that. He had set the strikeout record in the first game when he beat the Tigers handily, and he was ready to pitch this final game, and there was never any better one-game pitcher than Bob Gibson. But Lolich was equal to the occasion, and they battled for 7 innings. It was 0-0, and the Tigers with 2 out got singles from Cash and Horton. And then Northup stepped up and hit a 3-base hit over the head of Flood, the center fielder. 2 runs scored, and the Tigers went on to win the World Championship. Lolich became one of the few pitchers ever to win 3 games in a World Series, and he was a World Series hero, and he certainly deserved it.
How about Curt Flood's play of that hit?
Well, there was a lot of question about that, whether it was a legitimate triple or not. I thought so. It just seemed to me, as I saw it then and looked at it later on in the replays, that he took one misstep probably and then almost tripped and the ball got over his head. But it might have been over his head even if he hadn't come in on it at first. You never know. And you got to give the credit to Jim Northup. And as they say, look at the box score and you know what really happened.
Now it's Cash at second, Willie Horton at first base. Game tied in the 7th. Time call by the Cardinal catcher McCarver. He goes out to talk to Gibson. Ernie, maybe Jim McCarver or Bob Gibson may have heard Frank Blair on the Today Show this morning when he said the NBC computer said that Jim Northup would hit a home run with 2 men on today. Maybe they better walk and said, let's strike out that computer, eh? Now the set by Gibson, we're ready. There's a swing and a fly ball to center. Here comes Flood, digging hard. He almost fell down. It's over his head for the hit. Cash is rounding third. He scores. Willie Horton rounding third. He scores. Northup goes into third base. Detroit leads 2-0.
As divided as the city had been in '67, what did the '68 World Series do for bringing the community back together?
Well, it was a great factor in the healing of the city because people could root for a black guy or a white guy or a purple guy or a green guy or whatever if he was a Tiger, and they all forgot about the other stuff. And I think another factor in the whole scheme of things was that the newspapers had gone on strike around Thanksgiving of 1967. So there was no print coverage of the Tiger '68 season at all until maybe mid-August. So they got through almost the whole season without any newspapers. And that put the emphasis on radio and on TV. So people could be in a car next to a guy and he'd be listening to the radio and they'd say, well, how are the Tigers doing? Or you could walk through the neighborhood, hear the ball game, or you could see TV in all the taverns and all the restaurants. And it was the topic of conversation all through the summer, what the Tigers were doing.
Phone calls have made such an important impact on your career, your life. And in 1981, you got another phone call from a little bitty town in northern New York, Cooperstown.
Yeah, right. They didn't call me direct for some reason. I don't know what the procedure is at Cooperstown for the Ford C. Frick winner, and that was the award I won that got me into the Hall of Fame. But they had called Jim Campbell. Maybe they were trying to find me because I was down in Florida. And Lula called me to the phone and said, "It's Mr. Campbell." And I answered the phone, and Jim said, "Congratulations." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you've been elected to the Hall of Fame." And that probably was the biggest thrill that I've ever had, because it meant going up there and being on the platform with those great players and having all the family there. It was a great thing for me, and it was a phone call that I really cherish.
I praise the Lord here today. I know that all my talent and all my ability comes from Him, and without Him I'm nothing, and I thank Him for His great blessing. You know, the life and times of Ernie Harwell could be capsuled, I think, in two famous quotations, one from a left-handed New York Yankee pitcher and the other one from a right-handed English poet. The Yankee pitcher Lefty Gomez once said, "I'd rather be lucky than good." And the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson once wrote in his epic poem Ulysses, "I am a part of all that I have met." Well, I know that I'm a lot luckier than I'm good. I've been lucky to broadcast some great events and to broadcast the exploits of some great players. That other saying, "I'm a part of all that I have met," I think that would have to begin with my wonderful parents back in Atlanta. When I was a youngster, 5 years old, I was tongue-tied. They didn't have much money, but they spent what they had sending me to speech teachers to overcome the handicap. I know that a lot of you people who've heard me on the radio probably still think I'm tongue-tied. But through the grace of God, officially, I'm not tongue-tied anymore. I'm a part of you people out there who've listened to me, because especially you people in Michigan, you Tiger fans, you've given me so much warmth, so much affection, and so much love. I know that this is an award that's supposed to be for my contribution to baseball, but let me say this. I've given a lot less to baseball than it's given to me. And the greatest gift that I've received from baseball is the way that the people in the game have responded to me with their warmth and with their friendship.
The Tigers get back to the World Series in 1984. Great start to the season. You go 35-5 right out of the chute. That just propelled that team to great things.
Oh, it did. When you win 35 out of the first 40 games, you've got such a nice cushion that you know unless there's a complete collapse, you're going to make the playoffs. But ironically, Sparky Anderson told me that that was the most nervous season he'd gone through as a manager, because the Tigers were establishing this magnificent record. Sparky always feared they would hit the playoffs and be eliminated and not get in the World Series, and it would take away the achievement of the team in the regular season. And it did bother him a lot. They didn't have a lot of superstars, but they had Jack Morris and Lance Parrish and Gibby and some of those guys. And Trammell, of course, was a superstar, Whitaker. But they seemed to just get together and do the right thing, and they built confidence as it went along, and it was a great season to be around. But I remember one incident that we had in Anaheim. The Tigers had been on Sports Illustrated. They'd been in Sporting News. Sparky had been featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Everybody was writing about Sparky and the Tigers, and they were breaking the record for most consecutive road wins. And they won a game in Anaheim, and they won another game in Anaheim, and we were getting ready to go to Seattle. And Sparky and I was sitting in the coffee shop there at the hotel in Anaheim, and a guy comes up and interferes with Sparky's breakfast. He says, "Hey, I'm from San Diego, Spark, and I used to be in Cincinnati. I'm a great Cincinnati fan, the Big Red Machine. You are the greatest manager in baseball. You are simply terrific. By the way, what are you doing now?" And Sparky went back to his cornflakes immediately.
They did not lose in the playoffs. They advanced to the World Series. How'd they take care of business?
Well, they took care of business with good pitching and good balance. They swept the series with Kansas City. They had no trouble at all with the Kansas City team. Then I think most of the people around Detroit were sort of hoping that the Cubs would win their playoff and those two teams would meet in the World Series, because there was somewhat of a rivalry between Chicago and Detroit. But Mr. Garvey saw differently, and he led the San Diego Padres past the Cubs, and the Padres were the team that represented the National League against the Tigers. And the Tigers went out there, opened the series, and won the first game, lost the second, and then won all the others. And it was a great time in Detroit. The celebration was marred to some extent by a guy barbecuing a taxi cab, and that picture got all over the world. It wasn't really symbolic of the city at that time, but people made the world feel that it was. But it was a great time in Detroit, and I think we still celebrate that '84 team.
There was a dramatic moment in that ball game, and you alluded to Gibby a few minutes ago. Kirk Gibson hit a dramatic home run in the 8th inning that put the Tigers up and pretty much wrapped up the series, didn't it?
Well, that iced it, yeah, and he hit it against Gossage, who had always been a nemesis of Gibby's, and the first time they'd ever met, Goose struck him out, and Goose talked Dick Williams into keeping him in the ball game, and after that short conversation, Gibby parked one in the upper deck in right field for the climactic home run of that World Series.
And they will walk Gibson, I believe, with Parrish coming up. There's no error, by the way. That is ruled a sacrifice fielder's choice. But Templeton knows how it's scored in his own scorebook. It figures they'll take the bat right out of Gibson's hand. And now Dick Williams is going to go out there because Kennedy held up 4 fingers and then went up to the mound. Well, let's see.
Well, you gotta believe that he's going to put him on with 4 pitches. But if he starts to fool around and throw a couple pitches and get a couple strikes, don't you know that Sparky will be screaming about that Raleigh Fingers Johnny Bench play?
That's right. You have to turn the clock back with 2 strikes on Bench. Dick went out to the mound, talked to Fingers. Tennis held his hand out as if we're going to put him aboard. Suddenly, Tennis dropped into a crouch. Bingo, strike 3.
Well, they're making a decision here, and Williams is in charge.
You know what's interesting? Kirk Gibson made his major league debut, his very first at-bat in the big leagues, against Goose Gossage. That's a great way to break in. And Gossage struck him out on 3 pitches.
Blew him away, Sparky says.
And maybe because of that, Gossage is saying, I can get him. Well, we'll see. Ball 1. The infield is up. They give Gibson the left field foul line. Brown is in left. And there it goes!
Who would win, 68 or 84?
Well, I've dodged that question all my life, so I'm going to dodge it one more time, I think. They were 2 great teams, and I think they are my favorite teams. I did pick the Yankees as the best team, but my favorite team would be one of those 2, 68 or 84. I'd say it ended in a flat-footed tie, but both of those teams got off to a good start, and they had great balance. Each had a terrific catcher, Bill Freehand and Lance Parrish. They had a good Keystone combination, and they had a good center fielder. So that was a great fundamental fact for each one of those teams. And the 68 team had an interesting year because they were more of a come-from-behind team. They got out in front early in the season, and they were in the first place except for 6 games. But as far as an individual game, they always had a different hero. They'd get a guy off the bench that would hit a home run. Tommy Matchik, Dick Tracewski, Jim Price, somebody like that would hit a home run. They had a great home run hitter in Willie Horton, but they didn't have a 300 hitter for the season, not among the regulars. Willie Horton led the team hitting about 285. But they had good power, and they had pretty good speed, and they had great defense. And, of course, they had terrific pitching in Denny McLain, Mickey Lolich, and Earl Wilson. And they didn't have the bullpen that the 84 team had. But in those days, you didn't depend on the bullpen like you do now. In 84, of course, they got off to the 35-5 record, and they had a great team. And I don't know, you'll never beat Lou Whitaker and Alan Trammell. And they had a terrific center fielder in Chet Lemon. And Darrell Evans came and hit a lot of home runs and helped out. So It was just a great team, and I don't think one's any better than the other. I'm not going to make a choice there.
It seems like, I don't know whether it's a prerequisite for a Hall of Fame denotation, but a lot of Hall of Fame broadcasters, including you and I, have been fired at one time or another.
Yes, Bob. Quite a few Hall of Famers have been fired in the course of their careers. Mel Allen and Red Barber, the first two that ever went into the Hall of Fame, were both fired by the New York Yankees. And then a lot of the other announcers, Harry Carey, for instance, has been fired. I got fired in 1990. We had a meeting at Tigers Stadium, and the Tigers told me that I would work one more year, and after that I wouldn't come back. And I understood that. I think when you work for somebody, he's got a right to hire you, and he's got a right to fire you. And also I realized as a baseball historian that nobody lasts forever, and everybody can be replaced. And I never held any bitterness or acrimony about that. I just went ahead and tried to do the job. And after the 1991 season, which was my final season, I worked for the California Angels. I did some games for them, and I did the Game of the Week for CBS, which I had done from time to time before when I could get off. But it was a part of my career that really got me into the national spotlight a little bit more than I had been. And I think, as the Bible tells us, all things happen for good, and I think it was probably the best thing in the long run that ever happened in my career.
When a door closes, a window opens. And sure enough, a great window opened for you, because then you took your integrity that you'd had in the booth and you went into the corporate America world for what was going to be a brief period of time, but it's turned out to be almost a second career.
It is a second career, and I've been with the Blue Cross Blue Shield as their spokesman. I've done a lot of commercials. I've worked for different companies. I've met a lot of people in industry and commerce that have helped me out and made me feel a lot better and certainly aided my career in the long run.
1993 brings a change in ownership of the Tigers and a chance for you to return to the broadcast booth.
One of the great things that happened to me in my career, my lifetime for that matter, was that Mike Ilitch, after he bought the Tigers, one of the first things he did was to bring me back to the Tigers. My agent, Gary Spicer, had called him from Arizona. He said, "Come in and bring Ernie. I want to talk to you." The next day, we got in there. They fixed up a letter in 20 minutes, and I was back with the Tigers.
September 27th, 1999, Ernie, you would say goodbye to an old friend. Tiger Stadium, that was the last home game that you got to work in that facility. It was with Kansas City, and a grand slam homer in the bottom of the eighth by Robert Fick kind of set things up for you to take it through the ninth inning and wish that stadium goodbye.
It was a wonderful time for me, and I think for all the fans of Detroit, and a little bittersweet, though, because we were saying goodbye to the old ballpark that everybody had loved over the years. And the great thing was that all the old Tigers were brought back. They had a terrific ceremony. Eldon Arca and Brad Osmus, the two representatives of the new and the old Tigers. And the terrific thing about that whole night, Bob, was the reverence that the crowd showed to Old Tiger Stadium, because they had a jam-packed stadium, and a little incident that might have been untoward could have ruined the whole program. But all these people jammed in together with a common bond, the love for the ballpark. They were very reverent of it, and the program went off without a hitch, and I think everybody really enjoyed it. It was a time of great sentiment for me because I was losing an old friend, and I think I almost broke up right at the end of my little speech there, but I did make it through, and it was a great day and a great night, and I will always cherish that moment. And the big crowd now anticipating the end of this game. 8-2, the Tigers in the lead. And here's the set by Jonesy and the pitch. It's the ball. Now, folks, I'm going to say my goodbye to Tiger Stadium, so I'm going to forget about the play-by-play for a moment. How do you talk to a legend? Can you say goodbye to a shrine? Can you walk away from a treasure? It's not easy. You do it with a lump in your throat and a tear in your eye. For almost 40 years, I've spent as much time at the corner of Michigan and Trumbull as I have at home. I've been elated, dejected, thrilled, and disappointed here. I've sweltered through the summer heat. I've frozen in the spring and fall. In sickness and in health, it's been my home, my office, and my refuge. When I first came here to broadcast, it was Briggs Stadium and then Tigers Stadium. And somewhere along the way, I began to call it the corner of Michigan in trouble, and soon shortened that to just the corner. To me, it will always be the corner, the most famous corner in Michigan. Tigers Stadium has been a dear friend, and even though I look forward to our new home, Comerica Park, and to the thrill of watching new Tiger stars, this old corner and its great players will remain a timeless gift to the past. The corner is part of our history, our heritage. It's been magic, hope, and the true heartbeat of our city. Baseball memories have come here to live and to be treasured. And you and I have been part of those memories. We've thrilled to the home runs, the strikeouts, the double plays. From generation to generation, we've joined that joyous crowd. And all of us love this old place. And its closing tugs at our heart. And like you, like all of us, I will cherish its memories. I know that there's never been a corner like Michigan and Trumbull.
Now comes 2002, your final season in the booth at Detroit. Did you do a farewell tour, so to speak? You know, players sometimes when they retire, you know, the different cities around the league will honor them with a chair or with, you know, different things like that. Did you have anything like that happen?
Well, we did have that. I really didn't like that very much, but it was something that you couldn't turn down. And you'd go to a certain city, Cleveland or wherever, and they'd say, look, we want to have a little thing on the scoreboard about you, and we want to make a presentation. Or maybe they'd say, we'd like for you to throw out the first ball. And that was very thoughtful of them. And some places, you know, we'd like to name the visiting radio booth after you. And it's something that you deeply appreciate, and you don't want to offend anybody. But it got to a point where it was almost the only time I could relax that season was when I was in the radio booth broadcasting the game, because the people probably paid me a lot more attention than I deserved, and it would have been a lot better if I had just gone my way without it. But there wasn't any way to avoid it.
Did you do anything differently that year in the booth once you got on the air?
I've always felt that the game is the thing, and the announcer is just a small part of it. People tune in to hear the game. They want to know whether the Tigers are winning or losing, what the score is, and it doesn't matter who's doing the game. They're going to tune in whether you work or you don't work because they are interested in baseball. Therefore, I think the game has to be the focus of the announcer and not himself.
Any regrets in leaving the booth when you did?
No, I don't think so. I felt like I wanted to quit while I was still doing fairly well. I didn't want everybody to get to the point where they were saying in large numbers, why didn't that old guy hang it up and let somebody take over that can do the job? I didn't want to leave with that kind of a feeling, and I felt like if I made a mistake quitting too early, that was better than making a mistake and staying too long.
Ernie, you've seen so many great players and moments in your 55 years in the booth, from Jackie Robinson stealing home on your very first broadcast to Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world to Willie Mays' debut with the Giants in 51. There are a few others, though, that help shape baseball history, aren't there? For example, Nolan Ryan had 7 no-hitters, and you were there for one of them.
Oh, yeah, that was a great moment. Nolan Ryan pitched a no-hitter against the Tigers. And not only pitched a great no-hit game, but he almost broke the strikeout record. And I think as a broadcaster, I was concentrating as much on the strikeout record as I was the no-hit performance. In the 9th inning, 2 out, nobody on, 1 out to go for Nolan. Norman Cash comes to bat, and he is sent back to the bench by the umpire. His bat is illegal. He comes up to bat with a new bat, pops to shortstop. Nolan gets his no-hitter. And I asked Norman after the game, I said, Norman, why was that bat illegal? What happened? He said, well, Ernie, we weren't hitting the guy, and I certainly wasn't going to get a hit off him. So I went in the clubhouse, and I got a leg off the table and took it up there to bat against him. Well, here's a very important last half of the 9th inning coming up. Nolan Ryan on the verge of setting baseball history. He is only 3 outs away from a no-hit shutout against the Tigers. And he is only 3 strikeouts away from setting the all-time Major League record in strikeout. Cash is struck out twice and bounced to second. 1 more out, and Ryan has a no-hitter. It'll be the second no-hitter pitched against the Tigers this year. Norman getting a new bat, and I believe that's going to be tossed out.
Luciano does not want him to use that bat. Been ruled illegal by the plate umpire. Oh, Norman gets a new bat. There are 2 down in the 9th inning. Ryan cannot tie the Major League strikeout record. He can tie Bob Feller's American League record of 18. And the pitch to Cash is a ball low, a curveball breaking in. Only 1 strike away from tying the American League strikeout record by Bob Feller. Here's the windup. He pitches. Swing and a pop fly back into left field. Going back, Maoli. He's there. Makes the catch. And Ryan has his no-hitter, but he does not tie the strikeout record. He is mobbed by his Angel teammates as he comes off the mound, and it is a no-hit victory for the young man from Texas, Nolan Ryan.
Ernie, one event that took the nation by storm was Hank Aaron's chase of Babe Ruth's career home run record. Being in the American League and not in the National during the time that was going on, what were your perceptions of Hank Aaron's pursuit?
I was rooting for Hank to break Babe's record, but I tell you, it was a tough thing for Hank because he got a lot of abuse about it. A lot of people felt like the Babe should always be the home run king. And I think maybe, in a lot of people's minds, he'll remain the home run king. But Henry Aaron got a lot of abuse that he did not deserve, and he went through with it, and I think did a tremendous job to keep his focus on baseball and finally break the record of Babe Ruth.
Henry Aaron in the 2nd inning walked and scored. He's sitting on 7-14. Here's the pitch by Downing. Swinging. There's a drive into left center field. That ball is going to be out of here. It's gone. It's 7-15. There's a new home run champion of all time, and it's Henry Aaron. The fireworks are going. Henry Aaron is coming around third. His teammates are at home plate, and listen to this crowd. A sellout crowd is cheering Henry Aaron, the home run king of all time. 7-15.
Did Hank Aaron sign a shoe for you?
No, he didn't sign a shoe, but he did sign a record. Bill Slayback, the Tiger pitcher, and I wrote a song about Hank Aaron's chase, and it was Move Over Babe, Here Comes Henry.
There was another home run, and then something that did not come about afterwards. Carlton Fisk and trying to find a hotel.
Oh, yeah, that was quite a story. That was a famous 75 World Series. That's the picture we've seen on television where he, with his body language, tries to coax the ball to stay fair. A home run, and he was the hero of that World Series victory. And Carlton told me later on, he said the problem was that I had driven down with my family in my station wagon from New Hampshire, and we got there rather late. We didn't have a chance to settle into a hotel or motel room. And when I got through with all the press and everything else and came out and got in my station wagon, I realized that I didn't have a place to stay. So they couldn't find a place to stay. Here's a hero without a place to lay his head.
Game tied, 6-6. Darcy pitching. Fisk takes high and inside. Ball one. Freddie Lynn on deck. There have been numerous heroics tonight, both sides. The 1-0 delivery to Fisk. He swings, long drive, left field. If it stays fair, it's gone. Home run! The Red Sox win! And the series is tied 3 games apiece.
Carlton Fisk hit a 1-0 pitch. They're jamming out on the field. His teammates are waiting for him. The ball hit the foul pole, and the Red Sox have sent the World Series into Game 7.
He hit more than one, but Bucky Dent's home run.
Oh, Bucky, yeah, that was a great moment for me. I was doing the playoffs for CBS. I did them when they started doing the playoffs. I was with them back in the mid-'70s, and I did them all as long as they had them. And on that particular day, the Yankees and Boston had tied in the regular season and forced a 1-game playoff at Fenway Park. And I did that game with Win Elliott, the great CBS announcer. And Bucky Dent hit a home run off Torres and gave the Yankees the victory. And the ball was just a little fly ball to left field. It barely made the Green Monster. I had a tape of that home run, and I gave it to Bucky several years ago, and I sort of apologized. I said, Buck, I just said that's a fly ball. And he said, you're right, that's all it was. Don't worry about it.
Well, he got some ethyl chloride, freeze him stuff on that ankle. He's back in there, choking the bat, waiting on a 1-1 pitch from Torres. 2 men on, 2 men out, 2-0 Boston. And the pitch on the way. He swings. There's a fly ball to left field. Yastrzemski looking back, and that one is gone. A 3-run homer for Bucky Dent, and the Yankees have the lead. Just into the screen, Bucky Dent hits a 3-run homer for the Yankees, and they go out in front of the Boston Red Sox here at Fenway Park.
You've had the opportunity to call baseball games that featured a lot of future Hall of Famers. How about Yogi Berra?
Yogi Berra was one of the smartest guys I ever met in baseball, a great friend, and I really love the Yog like everybody does. And I was with him on the Veterans Committee, and he came to that committee well prepared about the other players that we were going to vote on. He had great insight, and I think his sayings are full of wisdom. You know, he says it in a different way, but he's a very wise man.
Our guest is Yogi Berra. Yogi, what about all these stories? Now, we hear all these Yogi Berra stories. Some of them are true, some of them aren't. How did all that get started?
Well, I don't know. I think everybody, when they go to the banquets, they always mention my name on it. You know, Yogi said this, Yogi said that. I guess the one you could really get the truth on is Joe Gargiulo, because, you know, we grew up... we known each other a long time. He got a pretty good idea.
Well, Yogi, if you said all those things they say you said, you wouldn't be doing anything but talking all your life, would you?
You're not kidding. That's the truth. I don't know. Sometimes I say it, you know, when we're home, my kids and my wife, I'll say something. They'll say, there's another one. So what did I say? You know, and all that. But usually I didn't say all them things. Some are true, and like you said, some are false.
What do you think Yogi Berra would have done if he hadn't been a big league ball player?
My gosh,
what kind of business would you have been in?
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you, Ernie. I know I worked in a shoe factory when I was a kid before I started playing ball. Maybe I might have still been there in the shoe factory. I don't know.
Now, you've been a player, you've been a coach, you've been a manager. Which is the most fun in the big leagues? Playing?
Playing is the best fun. I know that. Well, coaching is too. You know, see these kids. You know, if you get some good ones, you know, make you happy and everything. And I enjoy it. This is my 41st year now, Ernie, and I still enjoy it. I think if I didn't want to do it, I don't have to do it, but I like it. I can't wait till spring training comes along.
What's the kick out of coaching? See young kids develop. Is that it?
You know, help out the catchers, young catchers, and everything, and. It is good, you know, to see some young kids come along.
Yogi, what's the most important thing a young catcher has to learn when he comes to the big leagues?
Boy, if they, I know they're hard to find now, Ernie. I know that. We're looking for one over there ourselves, and I don't know. I think the kids just don't want to do it no more. They think
they don't want to work hard enough.
Work hard enough for it, and I always try to tell them it's the best position to play. You have a lot of fun. You get to talk to everybody up there, and you're in the game more and everything. We have one kid over here, a kid named Greg Biggio. We just signed him out of Seton Hall. I don't know if you see him today, but he really wants to play. He's really got a lot of life, and he takes charge for a young kid.
What's the secret of throwing for a catcher? Getting the ball off quick?
Well, it's I see a lot of catchers today, Ernie. Well, I can't show it to you on here. they seem like they catch the ball first and then they throw it. I always like to go up for the ball like an infielder did.
I see.
And throw it because you get, like an infielder. I like to move with my right foot first into the ball and then you put something on it. You get a lot of the catchers, they catch it and then they throw it. They throw like a lot of flat foot and everything. They do all their movement after they catch the ball instead of doing it while the ball's in flight. A lot of them think they say, well, the hitter's going to hit me, if I start moving.
Right.
And I try to teach, you won't get hit. I let him swing and so you won't hit me.
Sure.
And but it's tough to do some of them. I don't know. Like Dickie, when he got a hold of me, my gosh, he worked my butt off every day. So you get used to it. I used to go home after workout, stand in front of a mirror to work on my footwork, just to see how I was doing.
Well, it paid off for you.
Oh, I loved it. I owe everything to Bill Dickey.
A gentleman who pitched in Detroit, Jim Bunning.
Jim Bunning was a great guy. I liked Jim. He was a very smart guy, one of the first proponents of the baseball union, one of the strong proponents of it. And he was a fine pitcher also and was later traded to Philadelphia where he pitched the perfect game against the New York Mets. And then later on, as everybody knows, he was elected to Congress from Kentucky, and then after being a congressman, he moved over to the Senate and has been a very influential guy. I got a sort of a kick out of Jim's testimony when they had the big test about drugs in baseball, when he made this epic speech about cheating in baseball. People should not cheat. But I remember a game in Baltimore where he was scratching the ball on his belt buckle, and Billy Hitchcock, the Baltimore manager, collected about 10 or 12 baseballs, went to the umpire and said, this guy's cheating. But they didn't do anything about it. But that's part of the game, I think, and I certainly excuse the senator for that.
Sometimes it's all a matter of perspective.
You're right.
Now, some players have had careers interrupted by military service, others more tragically. And the first one that comes to mind is Roberto Clemente.
Roberto was a great guy. He got his 3,000th hit in the final year of his career, and then that December, the big disaster hit down in Nicaragua, and he wanted to help from his native Puerto Rico, and he was sending supplies down there, collecting them, getting money for the folks who had been hit by this disaster. And he wasn't too satisfied because they were draining off some of the money, so he got on the plane himself, helped load the plane, got on it, and it took off and got no farther than a couple of 100 yards before it fell into the ocean, and Clemente gave his life for that cause. So he did a lot more than just played baseball, but he was a sort of a misunderstood guy. He was a guy that the Dodgers had signed and hidden away, but then when Branch Rickey went to Pittsburgh, he knew about Clemente and got him back into the spotlight, signed him for Pittsburgh. Then he made his great Hall of Fame career there.
Holder of the longest consecutive game hitting streak in baseball history, the Yankee Clipper.
Joe DiMaggio certainly was one of the superstars of baseball. He had the celebrity status of a rock star, and he had so much pressure put on him that he hid away from people, and a lot of people thought he was diffident and cool. But I found him after I got to know him, and he got to know me a little bit, that he was quite warm and very responsive. I did an interview with him, and he talked about some of those great pressures put on him by the public and the celebrity that he had.
On the road, for instance, during the streak where we were pretty much left alone, my roommate was Gomez, and of course he did a great job of screening things. And it wasn't the fault of the fans as much as they were well-wishers, and at times they'd come knocking on the door about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and just wanting an autograph to say hello or things of that sort. And of course we had other people that wanted you to go to banquets or luncheons and breakfasts, all those kind of things. And I would have to say that was the pressure. Now, the thing that I did to escape most of all of that was to come to the ballpark about 4 hours early. So there was nobody at the park at that time, and I just hung around the ballpark.
Well, is it true that when you were coming to the park in Cleveland on the day the streak was broken, that the cab driver said that he thought the streak would be broken?
Gee, I thought all that stuff was forgotten, but I guess it's so true. That's the truth. And I was riding along with Gomez at the time, and Gomez jumped all over me. He just had the feeling. He turned around, he says, Joe, he says, I just have a feeling that tonight is going to be the night that they're going to break your streak. And Gomez, I could recall, just jumped all over him, and he kind of felt miserable about it because he told me later on, he says, that bothered me throughout that whole ball game.
And then the streak was broken, but you started the brand new one, didn't you?
And that is correct, but I must give a little credit there where it's due. And I think one of the great third basemen is the one that really stopped it, Kenny Kelder, who made 2 fantastic plays. And I think only a man like him who played along the line and made the long throws just nipped me, bang, bang, just so like that, But they had to come to an end at one time.
And then there were a couple of guys whose last name began with G, Charlie Gehringer and Hank Greenberg.
Charlie Gehringer was one of the real heroes of the Detroit baseball, the mechanical man, they called him. There's so many great stories about Charlie. I think one of the best that I like to relate is the fact he's the only Hall of Famer who did not attend his induction ceremonies, because when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, it was the same year that he had decided to marry his wife, Jo, and he had settled on a date. It was going to be out in California, arranged by Marv Owen and his wife. So they'd set this date, and it happened to be that when the Hall of Fame elected Charlie, they picked the same date for the induction. So Charlie decided it was more important to get married than it was to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Of course, he was inducted anyway, but he just wasn't there. But they used to say that he was a silent guy. He was a great personality, a good storyteller, and a wonderful person.
And then Greenberg.
Hank Greenberg was a true hero in Detroit. He was extra special because he fought prejudice just like Jackie Robinson did later on. And Hank went into the service twice, not once, in World War II, and gave a lot of his years that he could have been playing baseball to Uncle Sam. He was a great slugger. He missed out in the World Series in '35 because he broke his wrist in one of the first 2 games and didn't play from then on, and the Tigers suffered because of that. But he also hit a key home run when the Tigers won the pennant in 1945 against the St. Louis Browns when he first came out of the service, and then was one of the heroes of the '45 victory.
Now, you didn't broadcast any of the games this gentleman played in because he went into the Hall of Fame in 1942, but how about the Raja, Rogers Hornsby?
I think I remember him best managing in Cincinnati. He had a very different way of removing a pitcher. When he wanted to take the pitcher out of the game, he just looked down at the bullpen and give a wave with his left arm. He wouldn't even go out to get the ball. And he didn't allow food. He didn't allow anybody to drink water or anything else in the clubhouse. But he also had a great proclivity for the horses. He loved the horses, and he had his own tout to travel with the team when he was managing Baltimore in the International League. But he was all baseball, and you could sit there and talk for hours about baseball, but if you started another subject, he'd say, forget it, and walk away from you.
Bob Gibson, one of the fiercest competitors that baseball has ever known. He invented the glare, I guess, didn't he?
He certainly did, Bob, and he was Mr. Intimidation. There was nobody that he would knock down, and he didn't even want to put up with his teammates, One of the guys, I've forgotten who it was, came over to say something to him, and he said, the only thing you know about pitching is you can't hit it. Get back to your position. And he was a mean guy when he was on the field, but a very intelligent guy and a great pitcher. And when you knew him off the field, he was a terrific guy. But when he was in uniform, he was a great competitor.
Comparable to Don Newcomb, whom we've talked about, and
absolutely
Don Drysdale with the Dodgers. They were all brushback. They'd stick it in your ear if you gave them a chance.
They'd do it. They'd, as they say, knock down their grandmother if they had to.
Trying for number 16 right now against Cash to break the record. He takes his set position. He delivers. Here's the pitch. Swing and a miss. He did it. Another great ovation for Gibson, setting the new World Series mark. 16 strikeouts in the game. 2 down in the ninth inning. Horton the batter.
How do you compare or contrast them to, say, the finesse of Sandy Koufax?
I think Koufax had so much natural ability. He really didn't have to be as mean, as competitive as that. He was a good competitor, no question about it, but I don't think he really had to brush back guys so much because his fastball was so effective that people probably had a sense of fear to some degree when they went up there anyway. And he was just so good, he mastered control after a rather slow start in the big leagues. but he learned control, and once he got that fastball and his other pitches under control, he was invincible.
One of the nicest people you'll ever meet, and probably one of the most unassuming superstars you will ever find.
I think so, and it's something that really doesn't go along. Usually with the big winner, we usually think about the mean guys and the competitors, but he was just as you described him.
It is 9:46 p.m. 2-2 to Harvey Keene. One strike away. Sandy into his windup. Here's the pitch. Swung on and missed. A perfect game.
Prince Hal Newhouser.
Prince Hal, what a guy he was. A young guy that was pitching a pro ball when he was in high school, actually, during the wartime with the Tigers. And he had a great fastball, a lot of good curves, and he just blew down the opposition, no question about that. And there was a canard against Newhouser for a while among the voters for the Baseball Hall of Fame that he was a wartime pitcher, but he did a lot of winning when the guys came back. You had a lot of great ball players in 46, 47, and Newhouser was still a brilliant pitcher in that time. And I think he was one of Detroit's great heroes.
He had number 6 on his back and St. Louis on the front of his uniform. Stanley Musial.
Stan the man, what a guy, one of the most personable fellows you'll ever meet. He always went out of his way to be a gentleman. I've been on cruises with Stan and his wife, and we went on a cruise from New York on the QE2 down into the Caribbean, and we hit some rough weather around Cape Hatteras. And a lot of people got sick. Brooks Robinson's family got sick, and Stan got sick, and we got to St. Thomas. He said, forget it, I'm flying back to St. Louis. He got off the ship and went home. He had a great batting stance, and when I worked in Brooklyn, all the Brooklyn fans loved Stan. They were the ones that gave him the nickname, the man. And you'd go to St. Louis and ride on the team bus maybe from the train station past Sandlot baseball games, and every kid you saw had the Stan Musial stance.
If you were a Milwaukee Braves fan, it was spawn and sane and pray for rain.
Yeah, old Warren, he was a great left-hander. Warren Spahn won more games than any other left-hand pitcher. He was a fabulous pitcher who really got his start a little bit late because he'd been in the service. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and Casey Stengel made a drastic mistake when he was managing Warren Spahn before the war. Warren was in spring training, and Casey wanted to move a guy back from the plate with a fastball, and he didn't do it. And Casey said, well, you know, if you don't have guts enough to do that, you're going back to the minors. So they sent him back to the minors, and here's a guy who came to be a great war hero in the Battle of the Bulge. A little mistaken identity there, I think.
This man's baseball trading card is the most valuable in all the land. Honus Wagner.
Yeah, old Honus. Of course, despite rumors to the contrary, I did not see Honus Wagner play, but I knew old Honus because when I was with the Dodgers, we'd go into Pittsburgh, and Honus would sit on the bench, and I loved to sit there with him, and he'd chew tobacco, and he'd tell these terrible jokes, you know, that everybody would laugh at in respect of the great Honus Wagner, because he was a very old man at that time, but they said that he was the greatest shortstop of all time, at least throughout most of baseball. Some of those opinions might have changed now, but it was said that you could roll a barrel through those bow legs, but you couldn't get a ground ball through.
They said that no one would ever own the Boston Red Sox fans like the splendid Splinter, Ted Williams, did. The man who came the closest, though, Carl Yastrzemski.
Yes, sir, Triple Crown winner, great guy, and he could hit and field and do everything. Had a great spirit, too, and he was an interesting personality. He was a bear-down guy, but I liked Carl a lot. I got along good with him. I knew his father. His father had been a potato farmer out on Long Island outside of New York. Carl sort of came up the hard way, but he made the Hall of Fame and certainly deserved it. And like you said, Bob, there's no question that he's one of the real icons at Fenway Park.
Well, Ernie, with all the athletes that you've had the privilege of seeing, there have been a lot of teams that have accomplished a lot of things, but is there one that stands out among all the rest that you would consider maybe your top team of your 7 decades?
I think my top team would be the Yankees of 1961, and I think what made the Yankees so good was they had great depth, and they had good pitching. Whitey Ford was a bellwether of the staff, but what I remember about them is that they had 3 catchers. Elston Howard, Johnny Blanchard, and Yogi Berra. And all three of those guys could catch, play first base or left field. And I don't know how many home runs they had among them, but it was a whole bunch of home runs. Plus, the Yankees just had a good team. They knew how to play the game. They had great defense, and they had heavy hitting. And I'd have to say the 61 Yankees would be my best team.
I've got a picture that was taken of the Yankee dugout.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was right before one of the World Series games because it had the starting lineup that day with Skowron, Richardson, Kubek. Who was third base?
Boyer was third base, I guess.
Boyer was third
Yeah.
base, you're right.
Elston Howard.
Elston Howard, Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris.
Yeah.
And the pitcher that day was Art Dittmer. And Art gave me the picture.
Art, yeah.
And also Casey's standing there, but he's in a shirt and tie.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's great. And they had Terry, Ralph Terry.
Ralph Terry was
yeah.
on that, but Art pitched that day, so it was made of that day's starting
that's
lineup.
Great.
And
That's
he
fantastic.
autographed it for me and gave it to me. Ernie, we've talked about the influence that Paul Richards had on you and the other managers of the teams that you've worked for. Let's go back and talk for just a second, and maybe you can give us a little insight to some of these guys that you had an especially close relationship with. How about Bert Schotten?
Bert Schotten was a fellow from Bartow, Florida. He was a fisherman. He loved to fish. He'd played ball in the National League, played with the Cardinals and some other clubs, and he was very close to Branch Rickey. When Leo DeRocher was suspended by the commissioner, Rickey called his old pal down there in Bartow to come on up and manage the Dodgers. And he came up in 47 and stayed through 48. Leo came back and eventually went over to the Giants. But Bert Schotten was a very laid-back guy, one of the few managers that did not wear uniform. He'd wear a pair of slacks, and he'd wear a Dodger jacket. And he lived at the same hotel I did, the Bassett Hotel, when I broke in with the Dodgers in 1948. And I used to ride out to the ballpark with him after I got started with the Dodgers, usually with Bert and with the relief pitcher Hugh Casey. And he was a very wonderful gentleman. He didn't get excited one way or the other. You'd get on the train after the game. It might be a very tough loss, or it might be a brilliant victory, and you really couldn't tell the difference by the manner or demeanor of Bert Schotten.
Now, you also had the opportunity in Detroit of working with two managers who had made their name possibly with other teams. A guy who still owns the Major League record for being fired the most times by the same owner, the Brat, Billy Martin.
Yeah, Billy Martin was quite a guy. Billy came into the Tigers. He'd bounced around a little bit. He'd been a great player, and he'd managed at Minnesota. When he came to the Tigers, he was very popular at first, but as my mom used to say, he wore out his welcome. Billy had a proclivity for, after he got started and establishing himself in a job, he began to carp at the other people in the organization, especially his bosses, and it never seemed to work because you don't criticize your bosses too heavily.
Sparky Anderson, who had managed the Big Red Machine in Cincinnati to world championships.
Sparky was a big guy, no question about that. He had managed Cincinnati to the World Championship. He was a choice of Jim Campbell. When Les Moss was fired, Sparky came in. Actually, Les had a record around 500, but it was a chance to get Sparky, who'd been out of work, and Jim felt like if he didn't strike then, that somebody else would come in and get Sparky. And Sparky had sort of a 5-year plan, and actually it worked because after 5 years, the Tigers had a championship team. Sparky and I walked a lot. When we got to be good friends, we'd get up every morning and we'd walk for about an hour. We talked a lot about baseball, a lot about life, and I think I learned a lot from Sparky. He was pretty smart. He was an old used car salesman who knew how to close a deal, you know, and he could read the minds of his players and get the most out of them.
Charles Dillon Stengel.
KC, named after the town he came from. He was a failed dentist. He wanted to be a dentist, and he couldn't make it. And he came to the National League. He played for Brooklyn, and he played for the Giants. And he was a pretty good ball player, but he was always a clown. At Brooklyn, he doffed his cap one time, and a bird flew out. He hit a home run in the Polo Grounds playing for the Giants against the Yankees and lost his shoe running home his inside the park home run. Then he became a manager, first at Boston with the Braves. And he was a terrible manager because they had a terrible team. Somebody said the best thing that ever happened to the Braves was when Casey got hit by a cab and broke his leg and couldn't manage anymore. But then he went to the Yankees and he became a genius. And later on was a great manager with the Mets. But he was the kind of a guy, you'd ask him what time it was and he'd tell you how to build a watch.
Mr. Stengel, I'm not sure that I made my question clear.
Yes. Well, that's all right. I'm not sure I'm going to answer yours perfectly either.
I was asking you, sir, why it is that baseball wants this bill passed.
I would say I wouldn't know, but I would say the reason why they'd want it passed is to keep baseball going as the highest baseball sport that has gone into baseball, and from the baseball angle. I'm not going to speak of any other sport. I'm not in here to argue about other sports. I'm in the baseball business. It's been run cleaner than any baseball business that was ever put out in the 100 years at the present time.
Leo DeRocher.
He was very volatile. He would be up one time and down the other, and he'd had feuds with the writers, and he and his wife had feuds, and he had feuds with everybody. Leo had come off the streets of Connecticut in the boyhood where he hung around the pool halls, and he became a pretty good ball player, sort of a no-hit, great fielding shortstop, and then later made himself a manager. But I think the great thing about Leo is he instilled a certain amount of confidence in his players that no other manager that I've ever been with could do. Somehow they would really go to battle for Leo because they figured that he'd figure out a way as much as he could to win the game for them. Some of the players didn't like Leo. Some of them liked him a lot. But whether they liked him or didn't like him, they did play hard for him.
Just as there were characters who managed teams, I guess there were characters who owned the teams too. And the first name that pops up is the colorful Bill Veeck.
Oh, yeah, Bill Veeck was certainly a character. He was a maverick. The establishment didn't like Bill Veeck very much because he went against the grain a lot. He's the fellow that introduced the midget, Eddie Goodell, into baseball. He played against the Tigers. And Bill Veeck got that idea from a story by James Thurber. You could look it up. And it turned out to be one of the outstanding events in baseball history. Bill also had a lot of good ideas. He would make 3 or 4 speeches a day to try to promote baseball. He had a tough time with the Browns because they couldn't draw. The Cardinals were always the number 1 team there. With Cleveland, Veeck did a lot better. He won the pennant there, went to Chicago. He would sit up all night and talk baseball, and he had a wooden leg that he used as his ashtray. He'd smoke cigarettes. He was a chain smoker, and he'd flip the ashes in a little hole in his wooden leg. But he was a great personality, and he was always reading. He loved to read books. He loved literature, and he was a great guy to talk to. I really loved Bill Veeck.
Speaking of innovators, Charles O. Finley.
Yeah, Charlie O. was quite a guy, and again, here was a guy that the establishment didn't like because what Charlie O did, he proved when he went to Oakland that he could have a winner or the front office that consisted of himself, his brother, and a couple other guys. Whereas all the established franchises had a table of organization that included a couple of hundred people, and Charlie was doing it all by himself. And Charlie had a young African-American guy that looked like Hank Aaron, and they called him the Hammer. And Hammer would go down and get the lineups and bring them up to us. Then he'd talk to Charlie and sit in the booth with Charlie, and he turned out to be MC Hammer, the great rock star. Some of the guys at Oakland, Reggie Jackson and some of the others, gave him seed money to start his outfit, and he became a superstar in the music world.
The shipbuilder, George Steinbrenner.
I like George a lot. He's always been good to me, and I think he's good for baseball. I know he's got some detractors, but I like to see a guy who has the passion that George Steinbrenner does. He wants to have a winner, and he does almost anything he can to get it. He's a pretty hard guy to work for. He goes through managers like, most people go through socks and underwear, but he's a very smart baseball man. And I think when he got Joe Torre, it was really a smart move. My good friend Arthur Richmond made that suggestion. A lot of people didn't want Torre to come. He didn't have much of a record, but he turned out to be the perfect manager to work with George Steinbrenner.
Now, the commissioner's office. Without mentioning every commissioner and talking about each one of them, one stands out because of a decision that he had to make, and that was A. Bartlett Giamatti and the Pete Rose case. What did he face? What was the big problem as you saw it?
I think the big problem that the commissioner had at that time was what to do with Pete, because the Dowd report claimed that Pete had bet on baseball, and in that case, of course, he should be banned from the game. But Giamatti had a press conference, and he made a sort of a compromise with Pete. In the press conference, Giamatti said that Pete will be suspended for 1 year, then he'll have a right to come before us and see about the suspension. But in the meantime, we've all agreed that nobody will address the question of whether Pete bet on baseball or not. And then about a week or two later, Giamatti had a press conference, and he said to the press, well, everybody knows that Pete bet on baseball. So it sort of clouded the issue at that time. And then Giamatti died soon after that, and Fay Vincent took over. And it created a very gray area for a long time with Pete Rose. And my own feeling was that I really wasn't sure. Pete maintained that he didn't bet on baseball. The report said he did, but we didn't know about the authenticity of the report. And I was in Pete's corner, really. I felt like he had a great record in baseball. He made the most of his ability. He was a great player on the field. He had the most hits. He did all kinds of things. He was a team man. He won a lot of big games. And I was for him. But then when his book came out, my opinion changed, because he said in his book that he did bet on baseball. And it looked like to me he was saving the confession for a money-making proposition. And I think a lot of people that were in Pete's corner at that time turned against him as far as getting into the Hall of Fame. And, of course, the Hall of Fame is independent from baseball, but they cannot put anybody in who's suspended from the game. So it's not a question of putting Pete in at any point now until he is reinstated, the suspension is over, and he's eligible to go to the Hall of Fame. Now, whether he will or not, I don't know, but right now my opinion is that he probably should not be in it.
Is this the same scenario that Judge Landis had with Shoeless Joe Jackson?
Well, with Shoeless Joe, they actually had a grand jury trial. The White Sox players were exonerated in court, but Landis had been put in and given extreme power, so he decided, even in the face of the exoneration, he would suspend these 8 White Sox players who were on trial, and Joe Jackson was one of them. And a lot of people felt it was unfair because Joe had hit about .375 in the World Series, and it was hard to put a finger on a guy whether he had thrown a game or not, and there were all kind of rumors back and forth. But baseball needed a strong hand at that time, and Landis stepped in and did the job and banished all of them from baseball. And then Ted Williams, later on, you might remember, put on a campaign to get Joe Jackson reinstated and elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I was in favor of that. I thought Joe had paid his penance, He'd been suspended. He couldn't play against the professional players all his lifetime, and his life had practically been ruined by this. And why not honor him even if you did after he died?
Now, you've also had the privilege and pleasure, I'm sure, of working with and around and across the field, in some cases, from some great broadcasters. Russ Hodges.
Russ Hodges was a people kind of a guy, sort of like Harry Carey was later, without the flamboyance of Harry. He was the guy sitting in the bar with his best pal, and they were talking about baseball. And he had sort of a down-the-middle, easy style, very easy to get along with. He'd worked at Chicago and at Charlotte and Washington with Arch McDonald and all over the place, but he was a real professional. He came to the Giants from New York, where he had worked with Mel Allen. So he'd been around, and he knew baseball, and was a very, very popular announcer.
Backer throws. There's a long drive. It's going to be, I believe, the Giants win the pennant. 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 Bobby Thompson hits into the lower deck of the left field stand. The Giants win the pennant, and they're going crazy. They're going crazy.
Then there's the man who saw everything from the catbird seat.
That was the great Red Barber, who, along with Mel Allen, was one of the first of 2 to go in the Hall of Fame. They were inducted in the same year. Red was a real pioneer that all of us owe a great deal to, because he took baseball from a game where the station told the announcer to go out buy yourself a scorecard and broadcast the game. He was far from that. He was a true reporter, and it was very tough working for Red because he was a taskmaster. He wanted the very best, and I think it was great for whomever worked with Red that he was demanding. He had all these Southern expressions in Brooklyn, and he had a great advantage that Mel also had of coming into New York and being the first big league announcer that the people of New York had ever heard, because big league baseball was not broadcast in New York until 1939.
Big Branca called on for his most important job in his baseball career. Well, everything's the most important for all of these players as they come around. Here it is. Steering hot. Branca pumps. Delivers. The curve swung on and fell it deep back to left field. It is a home run. And the New York Giants win the National League pennant, and the Polo Grounds go wild.
And then, as distinctive as Red's voice was, the man you just mentioned, how about that, Mr. Mel Allen?
Well, Mel Allen was the voice of baseball, no question about that, because of his affiliation with the Yankees, and they were always in the World Series, and Mel Allen did all the World Series, so he got more national acclaim, I think, than anybody. He had great enthusiasm, he had a deep, resounding voice, and he had a terrific passion for baseball. I think his whole life was wrapped up in baseball. Never married, and he lived with his mom and dad, and everything that he did was wrapped up in his job. He did the Rose Bowl for NBC, he did the World Series, and he did a lot of big events, and he also did the newsreels, and was a guy who started a second career after the Yankees fired him in the 1960s. He was out for a couple of years, and then Joe Reichler, working for the commissioner, got Mel a job on This Week in Baseball. And he made a completely new career for many, many years as the voice of This Week in Baseball. A lot of younger fans probably never heard him broadcast a game, but they know all about Mel Allen.
Mickey Mantle at bat with a count of 1 ball, no strikes. Left-handed pitcher Chuck Stobbs on the mound. Mickey Mantle, a switch hitter, batting right-handed, digs in at the plate. Here's the pitch. Mantle swings. There's a tremendous drive going into deep left field. It's going. It's going over the bleachers and over the sign atop the bleachers into the yards of houses across the street. It's got to be one of the longest home runs I've ever seen hit. How about that?
A gentleman whose tenure in Los Angeles rivals yours in Detroit, Vin Scully.
Vin Scully, I think, is the best baseball announcer that ever came along. I think he's fantastic. He had the good fortune of going to L.A. with a good team. Nobody had ever heard a big league announcer at that time. And it was a city of automobiles and transistors, and everybody had to listen because the Coliseum where the Dodgers played was such a bad place to see a ball game. You really needed a radio description to go along with it. But in addition to that, he just had great talent. And always did have. He broke in very young. He was about 22, I think, when he started. And my real claim to fame, Bob, is the fact that he took my place. On the CBS Roundup for football, when I was switched to another game, Red Barber had to give Vinny his first job, and that was broadcasting a game in Boston. And he did a good job. And then when I left the Dodgers to go to the Giants, Red Barber called, and by the way, Vinny's mother said Red Skelton called, but it was Red Barber, and he offered Vinny the job to do the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he's been there ever since. He's a magnificent announcer.
Little roller up along first, behind the bag. It gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it.
Then there was the cowboy from Wyoming who ended up behind the mic in Fenway Park in Boston.
That's Curt Gowdy, the great basketball player who became a very versatile announcer. He could do baseball, football, basketball. He could do everything. He might not have been the very best in each one, but I think as far as overall versatility, you'd have a hard time matching Curt Gowdy. I worked with Curt quite a bit, most of the time on CBS, and he was always on the telephone. He was a great businessman, and he took care of business with all his radio stations while he was broadcasting. And he loved to do the American Sportsman on TV, And I know that he went out with a lot of great celebrities. And Bing Crosby and Phil Harris pulled a big joke on Kurt because of the situation they had on American Sportsman. They were always kidding him about always having a phone. And they did a show from a duck blind. And in those days, they didn't have a cell phone. They gave Kurt a real phone to use in the duck blind.
The count 1-1 to Williams. Everybody quiet now here at Fenway Park after they gave him a standing ovation of 2 minutes, knowing that this is probably his last time at bat. 1 out, nobody on, last of the 8th inning. Jack Fisher into his windup. Here's the pitch. Williams swings, and there's a long drive to deep right. That ball is going, and it is gone. A home run for Ted Williams in his last time at bat in the Major League.
Well, Ernie, there's one broadcaster who was not known as a play-by-play man, but you had a long and very nice association with Paul Carey.
Paul Carey was one of my many great partners. I had a lot of partners, and all of them were good, but I'd have to tip my hat first to Paul Carey because we were together longer with him than any other partner that I had. Paul and I existed together about 18 years as the Tiger announcers, and I think Paul Carey had the best sports voice of anybody I've ever heard. The people around Michigan said it was the voice of God. But the problem with working with Paul was he made everybody who worked with him sound like a soprano. But I was able to overcome that. He had a good grasp for the game. He'd come from Michigan. He grew up here. He knew all about Tiger history. And Paul was just such a wonderful guy to work with and so accommodating. And he had an extra duty in the last 15 or 16 years of working with me when the station decided that they would not use an engineer, that Paul Carey would not only have to broadcast, but he would have to do the engineering. The only outfit in the major leagues that did not have an engineer. So that was an added burden, but he did it and did it well. He was such a professional and such a great guy. I really have to pay tribute to Paul Carey.
Well, it's my pleasure now for the last time for play-by-play, unless we go into extra innings, to introduce a man who's meant so much to me in 19 years. We just couldn't do it without him. I've gotten a lot of accolades and a lot of attention. Much of it I didn't deserve, and I have to share more of it with him than he knows, Paul Carey.
Ernie, thank you very much for those thoughts. It has been an absolute joy for 19 years to have shared a Tiger radio booth with you. And it's now coming to an end. The Tigers finishing off the season here in Baltimore, but they've got a big 5-1 lead as Milt Kyler leads off the 4th inning. All he had a couple of pitches. There's a third, and it's a 2-1 count on Milt.
And then you have the first member of first and second generation Major League Baseball broadcasters. First, let's talk about Jack Buck.
Oh, Jack Buck was a guy that everybody took to. He had a nice, easy style. He had a sardonic kind of a wit about him. He was great. He did the Cardinal games. He was a big fan of Harry Heilmann. He grew up in Cleveland and used to hear Heilmann do the Tiger games. He came to St. Louis to work with Harry Carey. And then when Harry left, Jack became the big guy and was there for years and years. And everybody loved Jack Buck. And he was on Monday Night Football, too. And the thing I remember best about Jack in his closing years there, I was broadcasting a game at Busch Stadium in St. Louis, and I was back of the batting cage, and Jack Buck came up to me and said, "Ernie, there's only one good thing I can think about you, is that you'll never die young."
Hey, look at the way he's limping. That's impossible for him to come out and bat, isn't it? We have a big 3-2 pitch coming here from Eckersley. Gibson swings and a fly ball to deep right field. This is going to be a home run. Unbelievable! A home run for Gibson. And the Tigers have won the game 5-4. I don't believe what I just saw.
Well, he saw his son move into broadcasting, but another man who saw his son and his grandson come into the business is the aforementioned Harry Carey.
Oh, that was amazing, too, that 3 generations would broadcast in the big leagues, the only time it's ever happened. And Harry, I think, was probably the outstanding personality among all baseball broadcasters. He was flamboyant. He loved baseball, he really did, and deep down his heart, he was always such a fan. He was quite critical of the players, and they'd get on his case sometime, but it didn't bother him. He would say what he felt should be said, and he said it in a very authoritative manner. And he was a great showman, and I think the best thing that ever happened in any baseball broadcaster's career was what happened to Harry Carey when he began to sing the seventh inning stretch, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. That was a Bill Veeck production, you know. He talked him into it. But Harry took that to the Cubs, and it reached a great fulfillment at Wrigley Field, and they still do it, all in tribute to Harry Carey.
Let me hear you. A one, a two, a three. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. If they don't win, it's a shame for it. Let's go around at the old ball game.
Not all broadcasters, sportscasters, have a signature call. Some do. You do. I do. But not everybody. You didn't start out to have a signature call, did you?
No, I just started out doing the game, and whatever the signature calls that developed for me just sort of happened. I think probably the first one I came up with was he stood there like the house by the side of the road and watched it go by when a guy took a call third strike.
There's a breaking ball in for a strike, and he stood there like the house by the side of the road and watched it go by. Struck him out. That's the third strikeout for Holliday.
Long Gone was my so-called home run call, but I really didn't do that until the late 80s or the mid-80s. I didn't do it in 84. And somehow I just began to say, it's going, it's a long one, it's gone, it's long gone. And then I cut it back to long gone. And then people sort of asked me to keep doing it, so I did.
Right-hander against the right-hander. The outfield is straight up and deep on Fielder. He is the DH today. Swing, there's a drive to left. That one is long gone. Fielder weighs into that first pitch with his 29th home run of the year.
Well, Ernie, another one of your signature calls was on your call for a double play, 2 for the price of 1. Where'd you start that from?
You know, I don't know when that started or where it came from. Maybe it was inspired by Lulu's shopping philosophy.
Set the pitch. He swings. Bounding ball. Stopped by Truby. Throw to second. 1. Relay to first. 2 for the price of 1 for the Tigers. A great play by Truby to end the third inning.
The foul ball, caught by a man from Saginaw.
Yeah, that's another one of those accidents. I never did that in any other place. I didn't do it in Brooklyn or New York or Baltimore. But when I got to Detroit, I guess about the first year or so, maybe in 60 or 61, somebody hit a foul ball, and I said to my partner, that guy that caught that ball is from Saginaw, wherever I said. And then it just sort of caught on. And I'd walk through the ballpark, and somebody would say, hey, let a guy from Grosse Pointe catch one today. Or somebody say, hey, a lady from Windsor never has caught one. Why don't you let a lady from Windsor catch a foul ball tonight? So that's what we did. And then when we went on the road, we would know some outlying cities like New Rochelle in New York or Tenafly, New Jersey. A guy from Tenafly would catch it. Or if you were in Chicago, a fellow from Evanston might have caught that one, that kind of thing. It was a lot of fun. We enjoyed that.
Infield in double play depth for the Mariners. They've had a lot of ground balls so far today. Here's the pitch on the way. He swings and fouls it off. It'll reach the seats over back of the Tiger dugout. And the man from Walla Walla will take that one home.
Did you ever let a lady from Kentucky catch one?
No, Lulu had to stay home and take care of the kids.
From the greatest managers, players, broadcasters, and team, we're going to shift now to your most embarrassing moment. What was the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you while you were either on the air or in the booth?
I had a lot of embarrassing moments in my career, but I think the one that was most embarrassing happened in California. The Tigers were playing the California Angels, and Collins was at third base. Freehand's the catcher, and Collins steals home. He's called safe on a very close play at the plate. There's an argument ensues. Ralph Houck comes out of the dugout, and I says, here comes Houck out. He's arguing with the umpire, and Bill Freehand's at the plate, and he's beating his mitt at home plate. So luckily for me, it happened about 2 o'clock in the morning, Detroit time, and, never heard a peep out of anybody except one guy, my friend Pete Sark, who was an announcer who lived in Flint. He called me the next day and said, do you know what you said? I said, I don't know. I sort of thought I made a slip, but Paul Carey didn't react. What was it? And he told me, and I dropped the phone. Oh, me.
Tony steps away from the plate, gets back in. Collins is coming down that line a little leisurely right now. Crawford looks over to him. Now here he comes to the plate, stealing home the throw, and he is safe. It's a steal of home by Collins. Freehand is putting up a vehement argument with Garcia, the plate umpire. He claims he had him. Here comes Ralph Houck out. He's getting in on the argument. Crawford is over there watching. Freehand is beating his mitt at the plate.
Well, that's probably something that you're not most proud of, but what are some of the things you are most proud of?
One of the highlights of my career, I think, was being put in the Guinness Book of Records, the only media member who's in the Book of Records, and I'm in there as the most enduring baseball announcer. I'm very proud of the fact that the folks at the tower out at Metropolitan Airport named an airspace after me, so if you come in maybe over Jackson coming into Detroit, you got to go through an airspace named Ernie Harwell. First active broadcaster to enter the Hall of Fame. And I'm very proud of the press box dedication at Comerica Park that the Tigers accorded me, plus the statue that Mike Ilitch had constructed for me that is there in the ballpark. By the way, that statue did a good job because they put all the wrinkles in my pants. I weigh 350 pounds, and I'm hollow. Sports Illustrated named me as the radio announcer for their all-time dream team when they selected that team a couple of decades ago. And I'm very proud that the Detroit Public Library dedicated a room to Lulu and me to house my sports collection.
How would you want to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered in the in the will of some real rich guy. That's how I'd like to be remembered. Have you got any prospects for me? Well, I think the Bible in Micah says, Son of man, what does God require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? And that's what I've tried to do. I probably haven't done it very well, but I'd like to be remembered as making a try at that.
The Tigers have just finished their 2002 season, and I've just finished my baseball broadcasting career. And it's time to say goodbye, but I think goodbyes are sad, and I'd much rather say hello. Hello to a new adventure. I'm not leaving, folks. I'll still be with you, living my life in Michigan, my home state, surrounded by family and friends. And rather than goodbye, please allow me to say thank you. Thank you for letting me be part of your family. Thank you for taking me with you to that cottage up north, to the beach, the picnic, your workplace, and your backyard. Thank you for sneaking your transistor under the pillow as you grew up loving the Tigers. Now, I might have been a small part of your life, but you've been a very large part of mine, and it's my privilege and honor to share with you the greatest game of all. Now, God has a new adventure for me, and I'm ready to move on. So I leave you with a deep sense of appreciation for your long-time loyalty and support. I thank you very much, and God bless all of you.
This is an open letter to Ernie Harwell. Dear Ernie, 53 years ago, I followed you into Brooklyn. 20 years ago, I followed you into the Hall of Fame. And our relationship has only been perfect. Baseball is so much richer for having you all these years and poorer for losing you.
Sincerely yours, with love and affection, Vin Scully.
Hi, Ernie. Nice to see you, and congratulations on your retirement. You deserve it. I tell you, you've been one of the icons in the history of the game of baseball, and I feel very privileged to have been able to get to know you way back when you were doing Oriole baseball, going to your home and seeing the sporting news you had there, the history of the game, meeting your twins, and it's been a good road, and I tell you, you're going to enjoy your retirement a great deal, and I'm just privileged to be a part of baseball with you. Thank you.
Hi, Ernie. This is your old buddy, Tramp. I know you're retiring from the broadcast booth, but we all know this is just a semi-retirement. Hope the best for you and Lulu in the coming years. There's one phrase that's used quite often, you're the best. But in your case, Ernie, you simply are the best. We're going to miss you. All of baseball and all Tiger fans are going to miss you. Ernie, best of luck.
Mr. Harwell, this is Derek Jeter of the New York Yankees. I just want to congratulate you on your retirement. And from someone who grew up listening to you, you will be greatly missed.
Ernie, I can't tell you how much I'm going to miss you. I go back, like few other people anymore left in baseball, to the old New York Giants when Ernie Harwell used to be in the booth. But what I'm going to miss most of all is the visits in the clubhouse, the visit in the dugout, being able to talk with the old Hall of Famer and just talk about life. You're such a wonderful human being. There's plenty more gas left in the tank, my man, and I hope you make a visit from time to time. We're going to miss you.
Hello, Ernie. I'll be so glad to have you home soon to help me in the garden with getting rid of the old vegetable garden and making a new one and planting some new roses. It makes me think of how many times I've had to be alone. And I want to thank the fans for giving you back to spend the time with me. Hurry up and get home, Ernie.
William Ernest Harwell began his broadcasting career in Atlanta, Georgia in 1940. From 1948 to 2002, he called over 8,000 baseball games and in 1981 received the greatest honor of them all, induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame. From Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese, Willie Mays and Bobby Thompson, to Leo DeRocher and Sparky Anderson, Ernie painted a picture of baseball unlike any other.
Baseball is the president tossing out the first ball of the season and a scrubby schoolboy playing catch with his dad on the Mississippi farm. A tall, thin old man waving a scorecard from the corner of his dugout. That's baseball. And so is a big fat guy with a bulbous nose running home one of his 714 home runs. There's a man in Mobile who remembers that Honus Wagner hit a triple in Pittsburgh 46 years ago. That's baseball. And so is a scout reporting that a 16-year-old pitcher in Cheyenne is the coming Walter Johnson. Baseball is a spirited race of man against man, reflex against reflex, a game of inches. Every skill is measured. Every heroic, every failing is seen and cheered or booed and then becomes a statistic. In baseball, democracy shines its clearest. The only race that matters is the race of the bag. The creed is a rule book, and color merely something to distinguish one team's uniform from another. Baseball is a rookie, his experience no bigger than the lump in his throat as he begins fulfillment of his dreams. And it's a veteran, too, a tired old man of 35, hoping that those aching muscles can pull him through another sweltering August and September. Nicknames of baseball, names like Zeke and Pie and Kai and Home Run and Cracker and Dizzy and Dazzy. Baseball is the clear, cool eyes of Rogers Hornsby, the flashing spikes of a Ty Cobb, and an over-aged pixie named Rabbit Moranville. Baseball, just a game, as simple as a ball and bat, and yet as complex as the American spirit it symbolizes. A sport, a business, sometimes almost even religion. While the fairy tale of Willie Mays making a brilliant World Series catch and then dashing off to play stickball in the streets with his teenage pals. That's baseball. So is the husky voice of a doomed Lou Gehrig saying, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of this earth. Baseball is cigar smoke, hot roasted peanuts, the sporting news, ladies' day, down in front. Take me out to the ball game in the Star-Spangled Banner. And baseball is a tongue-tied kid from Georgia growing up to be an announcer and praising the Lord for showing him the way to Cooperstown. This is a game for America. Still a game for America, this baseball. Thank you.